The roots of hardcore gaming can be traced back to the arcade cabinets of the early video game era. These coin-operated machines were designed to challenge players with steep difficulty curves, requiring them to insert coin after coin to continue their quest for mastery. The intentionally high difficulty served a dual purpose: on a purely cynical level, to maximize revenue, but also to encourage players to develop their skills through repeated trials. For games like Ghosts and Goblins, Contra, Dragon's Lair, Battletoads, and so many countless more, each failure was a lesson, and only the most dedicated could conquer these digital gauntlets, eventually mastering the game's intricacies through sheer persistence and memorization. This relentless pursuit of perfection turned many players into true experts, capable of navigating even the most punishing games with ease. This arcade philosophy became a cornerstone in the design of early home console games. Although players no longer needed to feed machines with coins to keep playing, the core concept of limited lives and the ever-present threat of a definitive game over remained, forcing players to learn from their mistakes, memorize pitfalls, and anticipate challenges in order to progress is a staple of many of those games from the 1990s. Classics you may remember include Castlevania, the original Super Mario Bros., and the Mega Man series, Ninja Gaiden, and so many more. Success in these games was not guaranteed but earned through repeated attempts, fostering a deep sense of accomplishment when a particularly tough level or boss was finally bested. As the video game industry evolved and its audience expanded, developers began to soften the difficulty of their games in order to appeal to a broader range of players. The harsh, unforgiving nature of early games gave way to more accessible experiences, with difficulty settings and save points becoming standard features. As video games matured, they began to explore new forms of expression, particularly in the narrative design. The shift towards story-driven experiences led to a rethinking of game mechanics, where difficulties sometimes clashed with the flow of the narrative. In games like The Last of Us, where the emphasis is clearly on storytelling, characters, and atmosphere, excessively difficult encounters threatened to disrupt the player's engagement, leading to frustration rather than satisfaction. In such cases, balancing challenge with narrative progression becomes crucial to maintaining the player's immersion. Despite being rooted in the traditions of FromSoftware's earliest works, the Souls series has sparked an extensive debate on the nature of difficulty in games. Hidetaka Miyazaki, the visionary behind the series, has stated that for him, difficulty is not an end in itself, but a means to an end. It serves as a tool for players to grow, not just in their in-game skills and strategies, but also in patience and self-control. The intense challenge is designed to make the environment feel more threatening, echoing the tension and dread found in classic survival horror games. This amplifies the player's sense of achievement when they finally overcome an obstacle, etching the experience more deeply into their memory. To Miyazaki and his team, the goal is not to derive pleasure from the player's suffering, but to enhance the emotional and psychological impact of the game itself. The Souls games, while paying homage to the old-school difficulty of the arcade and early console games, transcend mere nostalgia. Death, a central mechanic in these games, is not just a penalty, but an integral part of the narrative and gameplay progression. The seamless integration of repeated deaths into the storyline, along with the absence of a traditional game over screen, showcases how gameplay and narrative can be intertwined in a meaningful way. This fusion of classic game mechanics with modern storytelling and emotional depth makes the Souls series not just a throwback to hardcore gaming's origins, but a shining example of how the medium can evolve. Dark Souls, its sequels and spin-offs are defined by their brutal difficulty, often to their own disservice. If you've only heard one thing about any of the Souls games, it's probably that they're soul-crushingly hard. A relentless crucible that tests the mettle of even the hardiest adventurers. Fairly or not, this particular topic tends to dominate the conversation whenever these games are released. As we spoke about earlier, perhaps this only makes sense. Demon's Souls' success is in no small part thanks to the word of mouth that spread, in part due to the difficulty and obscurity of the title. It stands to reason that there would be a compelling reason to lean into this as a selling point in later titles. The difficulty is intrinsic to its early adoption and success. The marketing team at Bandai tend to lean into this as a selling point too. The Prepare to Die edition that lured me into these worlds to begin with spelled out in no uncertain terms that it wanted me to suffer before I ever even put the disc in my console. I want to start this section with Miyazaki's own thoughts on the subject of difficulty, and why it matters in these games, spelled out from an article on the PlayStation blog. I feel like our approach to these games, not just Elden Ring, is to design them to encourage the player to overcome adversity. We don't try to force difficulty or make things hard for the sake of it. We want players to use their cunning, study the game, memorize what's happening, and learn from their mistakes. We don't want players to feel like the game is unfairly punishing, but rather that there's a chance to win a difficult encounter and make progress. We understand that the Souls-like games are regularly associated with impossible levels of difficulty with high barriers to entry, but we tried to design the games to make the cycle of repeatedly trying to overcome these challenges enjoyable in itself. So we hope that with Elden Ring and the new options it provides, it will be a success in that respect. The themes within many of these games speak directly to an innate challenge. You are presented as a character, whether you are the Tarnished, the chosen undead, unkindled ash, you are a foreigner from distant lands. You start with nothing more than the clothes on your back, an insignificant footnote in a grand land of legends, and over the course of many hours and the consumption of ever-increasing thousands of souls, blood echoes or ruins, you grow in strength and overcome overwhelming odds. Gods, monsters, and unspeakable horrors, often with little more than a sword and a will to persevere. Through the application of violence and perseverance in equal measure, you succeed. Throughout history, great empires and civilizations have risen to power only to eventually crumble into dust. From the Mesopotamians and Mayans to the Roman Empire, ancient Greece and the Ottomans, countless empires have faced decline or vanished entirely. The causes of their fall vary: internal crises, wars, external threats, and natural disasters. But the pattern of rise and fall seems almost inevitable. Historians have long reflected on this cycle, noting how history often repeats itself, with societies rebuilding on the ruins of their predecessors, rarely learning from past mistakes. This theme of cyclical decline is a common thread in fantasy literature as well. From the rise and fall of Tolkien's mighty seafaring Númenórean race, and the fading of the elven kingdoms in The Lord of the Rings, and the wider mythology of Middle-earth, George R. R. Martin's characters reflecting on the doom of Valyria and wistfully pining for those greater glory days lost to memory. Often in fantasy, the greatest of times are those of the past. The present merely exists in its shadow. In the shadowed lands of Dark Souls, an ancient and ceaseless battle rages between light and dark, embodied by the primal forces of fire. Beneath the intricate layers of this rich, complex universe lies a stark truth. The flame is fading, and the world teeters on the brink of an eternal night. Into this dying world steps the player, burdened with a grave choice: to rekindle the flame and prolong the age of light, or to let it gutter out, ushering in the dominion of the dark. Yet, as the saga unfolds, it becomes clear that no choice, no act of heroism or surrender can break the cycle. In Dark Souls 2, the same grim struggle is renewed, echoing the eternal return that haunts this world. No matter the victories or losses of the past, the wheel of fate turns again and we find ourselves where we began, trapped in an unending cycle of light and dark. Then comes Dark Souls 3, the final chapter in this epic tale. Here the cycle draws to its inevitable conclusion. The world has aged beyond measure, and the very fabric of time and space is beginning to fray. As the flame flickers its last, the lands converge in a twisted, decaying reflection of all that came before. A testament to the countless ages that have risen and fallen, familiar spectres loom, twisted in ways both familiar and alien. In this final hour, the player's choice carry the weight of eternity itself. The end is nigh, and with it the cycle of light and dark reaches its ultimate, inescapable climax. Now, at the end of time itself, the world faces its final reckoning. Whether the player chooses to rekindle the dying embers one last time, or embrace the abyss of the dark, the outcome is the same. Everything ends. The long twilight of the world gives way to a silence that echoes through the void. Dark Souls 3 closes the book on an age-old struggle, where every beginning has always been a prelude to the end, and now, that end has come. A fitting end for the Souls series. Yet even as the flames of this world die out, a whisper of something new begins to stir. In the ashes of Ariandel, a fragment of hope lingers in the painted world, where a dying creation gives way to the promise of rebirth. Here, in this secluded, fragile realm, Sister Frida, herself an echo of the Lady Priscilla of the original painted world, and the forlorn souls of the past cling to the remnants of an old world. But the true potential for renewal lies in the hands of the Ashen One, and a nameless painter, who, with a brush of ash, dreams of creating a new world, a world untouched by the cycles that have bound all before it. This hope takes shape in the final chapter, The Ringed City, where the quest of Slave Knight Gale unfolds. His journey to find the dark soul for his lady, the painter, to provide the pigment for her canvas, is a quest steeped in sorrow and sacrifice. Gale's unwavering determination leads him through the crumbling remnants of the world, past the fading echoes of ancient gods to the very end of time. There, in the blood-soaked ruins of the past, he secures the last fragment of the Dark Soul, a key to a new beginning, and yet, in this quest, Gale fails. He finally succumbs to madness. As you arrive, you bear witness to his diminished, frightening state. So, for the final time, you draw your sword from its battered scabbard, and at the end of all things you resolve one final duel. Gale's executioner's sword, eaten away and rotted with time, swings more like a lump of raw iron, intent on battering the Ashen One. The blade, like its master, diminished and lethal. Echoes of Artorias can be discerned from the patterns of his fighting, leaping blows, powerful thrusts, and acrobatic slams. As the battle draws on and you come closer to victory, Gale descends further. A primal clash of lightning, smoke, and spectral flame. Eventually, you claim victory. Gale, no god, but a slave knight, who persevered through to the end of the world for the painter he holds so dear, is at last laid to rest. And so, with the dark soul in hand, the Ashen One returns to the painter, who waits in the shadows of Ariandel, ready to create. What she creates is not merely another world, but something entirely new, a realm beyond the cycles of light and dark, beyond the endless rise and fall of ages. This new creation, born from the ashes of the old, promises a world unchained from the past. The echoes of Dark Souls find their ultimate resolution in Elden Ring and the lands between. Here, in a world shaped by the remnants of the old and the seeds of the new, the story continues, not as a repetition of what has been, but as a bold step into the unknown. The lands between stand as a testament to the painter's vision, a world where the cycle has been broken and something new and uncharted can emerge. The legacy of Dark Souls lives on, transformed and reborn. In Elden Ring we find something new, familiar, recognizable, yet unmistakably new. Gone is the duality that defined Dark Souls, the struggle of light and dark, primeval forces, replaced here by something wider and deeper and more human. Despite the continued use of a struggling pantheon of lords and gods. Yet even here echoes and remnants of the old remain. Perhaps this is an inevitable consequence of a world born from the remains of another. Here still, though the context changes, we find a kingdom locked in stagnation through the unnatural absence of true death. In Dark Souls, the concept of hollowing can be seen as an in-game representation of the player's real-world struggles to contend with what the game is asking them to do. Through a perceived sense of purpose, the player can triumph, staving off the madness of hollowing. The theme of stagnation is represented in these games as the downfall of once great powers, and only the player, through perseverance and constant improvement, are able to overcome that stagnation and triumph. The countless numbers of people who set down the controller in defeat leave their character to rot, destined to be forgotten in time, themselves hollowed by the ultimate defeat. Difficulty and theme are intrinsically linked in a way that we rarely see in gaming. Even in other Souls-likes that have boomed in popularity since the success of Dark Souls, we rarely see an attempt to justify crushing difficulty through theme and story. The mistake of many of the games in the Souls-like genre is a misapplication of difficulty. Rarely are these games difficult for the sake of challenge alone. The preservation of the status quo at the expense of everything else is unhealthy. In the lands between, as Lordran, Drangleic and Lothric before it, the great powers being directed toward preservation leads only to stagnation and decay. The toll of depression on a person is like a slow, invisible erosion. Much like the decaying worlds of Elden Ring and Dark Souls, where grandeur and beauty have long faded into ruins, depression wears down the spirit piece by piece. What was once bright and full of potential becomes hollow, as the weight of inertia presses down on the individual, pulling them deeper into a quagmire from which escape seems impossible. Depression creates a landscape within the mind that mirrors the world of Lordran, where memories of a better time linger like distant echoes, but the present is a twisted, darkened reflection of what it once was. In this state, change feels not just difficult, but inconceivable. The idea of moving forward, of breaking free from the grip of stagnation, is overshadowed by a heavy, suffocating fog. Depression distorts reality, making even the smallest steps forward seem like an insurmountable mountain. It's a paralyzing force, much like the curse of hollowing in Dark Souls, where each failure strips away a part of one's identity and will to fight. The player, like the person struggling with depression, becomes hollow in a way, feeling more disconnected from the things that once brought joy and purpose. The stagnation that dominates these game worlds is a poignant reflection of the emotional paralysis depression inflicts. As in the decayed realms of Lordran or the lands between, where the old order clings to life long past its time, depression convinces the individual that there is no path forward, only endless repetition of a bleak status quo. There's an gnawing sense of being stuck, and no matter how much the person may long for something different, something better, summoning the desire to change feels impossible. It's as if the mind is trapped in a loop, like the undead wandering aimlessly, unable to escape the crushing cycle of darkness. This emotional reality is captured in the gameplay experience of FromSoftware titles. Each time the player is defeated, they're given another chance, but that new attempt feels weighted with the memory of all previous failures. Depression works similarly. It convinces you that even if you try again, the result will be the same. The spark of motivation, the will to act, becomes buried under the weight of hopelessness. The world around you becomes narrower, darker, and smaller, just as the game world's decayed beauty begins to lose its luster the longer you wander through it. What once felt vibrant and full of potential now seems hostile and indifferent. There's a crucial emotional undertone in both Depression and the Soulsborne games, the constant grinding battle, to move forward even slightly, to fight back against the overwhelming inertia of depression is exhausting. In the game, overcoming a difficult boss or navigating a hostile environment requires focus, stamina, and relentless determination. In real life, pulling yourself out of bed, engaging with others, or even the smallest act of self-care can feel like fighting a monumental battle. Depression doesn't just drain a person's energy, it numbs their connection to what once mattered. The emotional landscape becomes barren. Like the Hollow Knights who have forgotten what they once fought for, the Tarnished or the Chosen Undead isn't just physically battling monsters, they're battling the crushing weight of hopelessness and apathy. They, like someone struggling with depression, are trying to reignite some long-lost flame, a spark that seems so distant, yet still lingers faintly in the darkness. It's a fight for something elusive, something that might bring meaning back to the void. Ultimately, in these games, the very difficulty and challenge is symbolic of this inner struggle, to keep pushing forward in a world that offers little comfort, where failure seems inevitable and the past weighs heavily on every step, is reflective of what it means to live with depression. Each victory, no matter how small, feels monumental, just as the player in Dark Souls or Elden Ring fights against the decayed remnants of the world's past. The person suffering from depression fights against their own mental decay, the loss of joy, motivation and purpose. And, just like in the games, where even in moments of triumph the world remains unforgiving, so too in life depression often doesn't yield easily to any one victory. Only by overcoming the great challenge of maintaining the status quo can something truly thrive. The status quo is a powerful, compelling thing. Only great willpower will shake it. In this way, difficulty and challenge is intrinsic to the experience of the game. It's a rare, beautiful synthesis that is only possible in the medium of video games. And, I believe, what has led many players to connect deeply with these worlds specifically. Both the fall of Arthur, as told in medieval legend, and Elden Ring resonate deeply with themes of decay and the inevitable collapse of once great kingdoms. At the heart of these stories is a narrative of decline, physical, moral and spiritual, that ultimately leads to tragic downfall. Although they are separated by centuries and mediums, both narratives draw upon the mythic tradition of heroic rise and catastrophic fall, exploring the consequences of human frailty, betrayal, and ambition. In the fall of Arthur, the seeds of Camelot's destruction are planted well before the final battles are drawn. Arthur's kingdom, built as a beacon of justice and unity, rests on a foundation of human flaws that slowly erode its ideals. Knights who should embody honor, courage and loyalty fall prey to pride, envy and desire. Lancelot, the epitome of knightly virtue, the greatest of all knights, betrays Arthur through his love for the Queen. Sir Gawain, celebrated for his loyalty, is consumed by pride and revenge in his relentless pursuit of Lancelot after the latter's affair with Guinevere. These personal failings reveal the fragility of Camelot's ideals and fracture the unity of Arthur's court. Arthur, too, falls victim to human failings. When a prophecy foretells his downfall by a child born on May Day, he orders the death of all infants born that day. A desperate act that ultimately sows the seeds of his undoing. Mordred, the only surviving child, becomes his betrayer. Arthur's choice, though made to protect his realm, ironically contributes to its ruin, exposing his own tragic flaws as a leader. This theme of decay through moral compromise echoes in Elden Ring, where Queen Marika's disillusionment with the greater will leads to her shattering of the Elden Ring. Initially devoted to upholding divine order, Marika's growing doubts about its justice drive her to rebel, fracturing the unity of her world. Her act mirrors Arthur's. Both seek to protect their vision, but end up setting in motion their kingdom's downfall. Both stories explore how the ideals that unite a kingdom can be destroyed from within. In Camelot, chivalric bonds are shattered by betrayal, pride and vengeance, as seen when Lancelot and Guinevere's affair divides the knights, sparking rivalries that ultimately lead to civil war. Similarly, in Elden Ring, the demigods, Marika's children, fight for power over the ring's shards, their ambition driving the lands between into chaos As Camelot's unity disintegrates due to personal betrayals, so too do the bonds in the lands between. In both worlds, betrayal, ambition, and the desire for power erode the principles that once held them together, showing how even the strongest realms can fall when their ideals are betrayed from within. In Arthurian legend, the Holy Grail is an emblem of divine purity and enlightenment, representing an ideal that few can attain. It promises healing for Camelot's ailing kingdom, yet the journey reveals the knight's moral and spiritual inadequacies, worsening the kingdom's divide. Most knights fail to reach the Grail, catching only fleeting glimpses of their goal. Only Galahad can succeed, purified to the point of transcendence, departing the mortal realm. Only the purest souls are fit for such a calling, while others are left to grapple with their unfulfilled ideals and shattered self-images. For Elden Ring's Tarnished, the quest to restore the shattered Elden Ring and claim the title of Elden Lord is no different. The Tarnished are summoned back to the lands between with a shared purpose, to restore order to a broken world. Yet, as they set out on their journey, each Tarnished faces not only external challenges, but the darker side of their own ambitions. Only one of unwavering dedication can ultimately succeed. It begins one evening in Camelot, when a vision of the Grail appears at the Round Table, prompting Sir Gawain and many other knights to vow to seek it, despite King Arthur's sadness at losing his noble companions. Then was King Arthur grieved, for he foresaw the ruin of his noble order. And turning to Sir Gawain, he said,
"Nephew, ye have done ill, for through you I am bereft of the noblest company of knights that ever brought honour to any realm in Christendom. Well I know that never again shall all of you gather in this hall, and it grieves me to lose men I have loved as my life, and through whom I have won peace and righteousness for all my realm."
The quest, of course, proved grueling, testing each knight's spirit. During his quest for the Holy Grail, Sir Percival encountered a lady of enchanting beauty who promised to aid him on his journey if he would pledge his service to her when she asked. Eager for help, Percival agreed, and the lady, seeing he had fasted for 3 days, ordered a tent pitched and a grand feast prepared. Grateful, Percival ate and rested, asking who his generous benefactor might be. She told him she was a damsel, unjustly deprived of her inheritance by a great lord, and Percival, bound by his knighthood, vowed to help her in her plight. After he had eaten, she offered him the strongest wine he had ever tasted, and bid him to stay with her, promising him comfort and all his heart could desire if he would but abandon his quest and serve her alone. Enchanted and tempted to forget his sacred vow, Percival nearly agreed. But at that moment his gaze fell upon his sword. Its hilt bore a red cross, reminding him of his vow and the true purpose of his quest. Making the sign of the cross on his forehead, he felt a rush of clarity, and at once the tent disappeared in a cloud of smoke, and the lady, revealed as a fiend, vanished from his sight. Ashamed at how close he had come to forsaking his path, Percival fell to his knees, praying for forgiveness and strength. He stayed in earnest prayer until dawn, when a mysterious ship appeared, ready to carry him onward in his quest for the Grail. Sir Bors faced a heart-wrenching choice in his quest. He discovered his brother, Sir Lionel, being brutally beaten by 2 knights on the road, yet, at the same moment heard a woman's desperate cries for help from the other path. Torn, Bors chose to save the lady. Sir Bors had been riding for days in search of adventure when he came upon a hermitage and saw, to his amazement, his brother Sir Lionel, whom he had assumed to be dead. Overjoyed, Bors rushed to greet him, but Lionel's heart was filled with anger. "You abandoned me to save a maiden," Lionel accused, seething with resentment. Bors, stricken, knelt and begged for forgiveness. But Lionel's rage was unyielding. Declaring him a traitor, Lionel took up his lance and attacked his brother, forcing him to the ground and trampling him under his horse. As Lionel prepared to strike the final blow, a holy hermit intervened, pleading with him to spare Bors. But Lionel's wrath was unstoppable, and he killed the hermit in cold blood. Just then Sir Colgrevance of the Round Table arrived. Shocked at the sight of the dead hermit and Lionel's blind fury, leaping from his horse, Colgrevance challenged Lionel, and the two clashed in a long, brutal fight. Bors, weak and barely conscious, watched in horror as Lionel overcame Colgrevance, cutting the lesser knight down to the ground. Seeing no other choice, Bors sorrowfully drew his sword to defend himself against his brother. But, before they could clash, a fiery cloud suddenly appeared, burning between them, and a divine voice commanded Bors to leave his brother and head to the sea. Stricken by the miracle, Lionel's anger fell away, and he forgave Bors. Bors, of course, obeyed the voice, journeying on until he reached the seashore, where he found a ship draped in white samite. On board he was reunited with his friend Sir Percival, and together they continued their sacred quest. Meanwhile, Sir Lancelot wrestled with his own failures. Once unmatched in battle, he was humbled when bested by another mysterious knight on the road. Galahad, his son, though he knew it not. Haunted by visions, and unable to enter the sacred chambers of the Grail, he realized that his pride and misplaced loyalty had weakened his spirit. A hermit advised him to pursue his quest with humility, for only then might he be worthy of the Grail's light. Sir Lancelot journeyed alone through dense forests, seeking the Holy Grail but encountering no grand adventures. One night by a vast lake, a mysterious voice commanded him to find and board a ship. Alone, the vessel carried him across unknown waters, finally bringing him to a castle guarded by fierce lions. Lancelot immediately drew his sword, ready to fight, but a voice chastised him from afar. "Ah, Lancelot, ever is thy trust in thy might, rather than thy maker." Ashamed, he sheathed his weapon, and the lions let him pass unharmed. Inside, Lancelot found every door open except one, which remained firmly shut. Hearing a sweet, holy chant, he knelt and prayed for a vision of the Grail. The door burst open with a blinding light, but a voice warned him, "Lancelot, forbear." Ignoring the warning, he approached the Grail, only to be engulfed in light and fall unconscious. He awoke weeks later, humbled and grieving, realizing that his pride had kept him from fully witnessing the Grail. At last, Galahad, Percival and Bors were reunited on a mysterious, unmanned ship that carried them across distant waters to the city of Sarras. Imprisoned by a cruel king they endured for a year, until the king's sudden death freed them, and a divine voice named Galahad as Saras's rightful ruler. There, Galahad ruled with wisdom, and one day, a vision of Joseph of Arimathea appeared, bearing the Holy Grail itself in dazzling clarity. Filled with grace, Galahad passed peacefully, having glimpsed the Grail in all its glory. With Galahad's passing, Percival and Bors returned to Camelot, bearing tales of their trials and the wonders of the Grail. Though the quest had left them forever changed, they brought some level of hope and reverence for the divine mystery they had seen, and King Arthur welcomed them back with a deeper understanding of sacrifice and the fragile unity of his round table. In Elden Ring, the quest to restore the Elden Ring and become Elden Lord mirrors the Grail quest in its themes of fragmented ambition and spiritual failure. The Tarnished, like Arthur's knights, are driven by a complex mix of noble ideals and personal desires, but the path to the Elden Ring is fraught with peril, corruption, and internal conflict. The Grail quest's revelation of personal failings is echoed in the Tarnished journey through a land marred by the ambition and corruption of its rulers. Each fragment of the shattered ring symbolizing not just the broken state of the world, but also the spiritual disarray of its inhabitants. In Elden Ring, the ring itself represents both the unifying force that once bound the lands between, and the fragmented state of the world's spiritual and political order. The Tarnished are revived to restore that order, yet, even as they strive to repair the ring, they encounter a landscape of shattered ideologies and power-hungry demigods. Each Tarnished, like each knight, brings personal ambitions and flaws to the quest, often succumbing to inner darkness. The broken pieces of the Elden Ring are scattered throughout a corrupt world, each fragment symbolizing a failed promise or lost virtue. Much like the knights who ultimately fail to reach spiritual unity in Camelot. Diallos Hoslow, born into a noble house, once sought glory and purpose in the grand path of the Tarnished, hoping to bring honor to his family name. But the path he chose led him far from his ideals, as grief and anger over the murder of his friend Lenya drove him to Volcano Manor, a place of assassins and shadows, where loyalty is only to vengeance. He convinced himself this was his destiny, lured by the words of Lady Tanith, who assured him that, to be a true champion, he must accept that honor was a cruel and tainted road.
According to Lady Tanith, I've got the stuff of champions. And champions, ironic as it is, are oft forced to walk a tainted path. It hit me like a bolt from the blue. That my former thoughts were simple naivety. Of course my heart weeps for Lenya. That unfortunate incident was a cruel twist of fate indeed. But succumbing to the pain and sadness caused won't make me a champion, will it? Lenya knows this, I'm certain. Fate has laid a hard road for us both, but such is true of any road trod by champions. I always resented these hands, their pale complexion, a far cry from any warriors. The shame of House Hoslow, but that won't be the case for long. They'll be darkened by grit once I've set out on the path of champions. The tale of House Hoslow is told in blood, after all.
With hands he once thought too soft and pale for battle, he threw himself into Volcano Manor's twisted cause. But bloodshed brought no peace. His heart still ached, his rage was unfulfilled, and his once proud path seemed increasingly hollow. Diallos finally confessed to himself,
It's just as my noble brother says. I'm a complete fool. I can't believe I thought I could become a champion. I haven't achieved anything at all thus far, even though I've dirtied my hands time and time again. No, it's worse than that. As things stand, I've given up on the path of revenge and sullied the name of my house. What an easy mark I must have been. How did it take me so long to realize, honestly? There's just no end to my foolishness, is there?
Disillusioned, Diallos left Volcano Manor and stumbled upon Jarberg, a small village of animated jars, peaceful and innocent. Ironically, it was his gentle hands that made him welcome among them, the same hands he had once despised for not looking like a warrior's. In Jarberg, Diallos found acceptance without bloodshed. The jars treated him with kindness, unaware of his inner torment or his need for vengeance, and in return, Diallos felt a rare peace.
I've put all that behind me, left the Volcano Manor, forging my own path now, making my own choices. Even a fool like me can look after some simple jars. Do you pity me? Well, don't. I feel like, for the first time in my life, I'm on the straight and narrow.
But when poachers came, threatening the lives of his jar friends, Diallos found within himself a courage he never knew. He stood his ground, soft hands clenched in defiance, fighting to protect the jars he had come to love. In a final desperate stand, Diallos gave his life to save them, defending them from attackers he'd never before had the strength to face.
Ah, you. Are the jars? They all right? Did I defend them? Then all is well. This fool proved his worth in the end.
When he fell, his sacrifice was honored by the jars who, inspired by his bravery, made him a part of their world forever. The baby jar who idolized him took him in, calling Diallos his warrior, a fitting tribute to a man who had finally found purpose and redemption. Brother Corhyn's story in the Lands Between is one of faith, hope, and ultimately heartbreak. At the start, he is a devout follower of the Golden Order, teaching its sacred doctrines to any Tarnished willing to listen. His convictions are unshakable, his purpose clear. When he learns of Gold Mask, a scholar whose silent meditations unveil the very fabric of the Order, Corhyn is drawn to him like a beacon, believing that under Gold Mask's guidance and tutelage, he can reach a deeper understanding of the Order's divine truth. Travelling by Gold Mask's side, Corhyn witnesses his master's revelations and finds his own faith fortified, as if the Golden Order itself had set their path. Yet, Gold Mask's research, with the help of the player Tarnished, leads to a devastating realization. The Order, which Corhyn had believed perfect and unassailable, is deeply flawed. The gods who represent it are just as fallible as the mortals who worship them. Gold Mask identifies this inconsistency as a fundamental flaw, a fracture in the Order that could unravel all it stands for. To mend it, Gold Mask envisions a new mended rune of perfect order, a restoration that would bring genuine stability and purity, free from the whims of flawed deities. For Corhyn, this revelation is a devastating blow. His faith had been anchored in the belief that the Golden Order, like the gods who govern it, was perfect and just. To accept that it has been compromised, that it is no better than a flawed mortal institution, is to tear apart everything he has lived for. Though Goldmask's discovery is perhaps noble, Corhyn finds himself unable to reconcile it with his faith. The idealized order he had dedicated himself to does not, and perhaps never did, exist. The final rift between them becomes inevitable. While Goldmask continues steadfast in his vision to perfect the order, Corhyn's spirit withers under the weight of this truth, his faith crumbling around him. Disillusioned, he parts from his master, leaving the quest that was once his life's purpose. Gideon Ofnir, the all-knowing, stood at the heart of the Round Table Hold, a mentor, a guide, and an enigma. His knowledge was vast and his counsel freely given, aiding countless Tarnished on their way toward the Elden Ring.
I bid you welcome as a true member of the Round Table. I am known as Gideon Ofnir. As a Tarnished who wishes to stand before the Elden Ring and become Elden Lord, I am accumulating knowledge, to be all-knowing. You now belong to a select group of fellows. As such, I ask that you remain constant.
To him, knowledge was a prize worthy of any sacrifice, and he pursued it ruthlessly, heedless of the bodies left in his wake. No lengths were too extreme. The slaughter of the Albinoric village, assassins, depraved perfumers, omen killers, even agents from Volcano Manor, each served Gideon's relentless thirst for understanding, though he cloaked his intentions in the guise of guidance. To the Tarnished, he was a mentor, guiding each one with insights that might lead them toward the Elden Lordship, even as he saw the journey as a brutal competition, a rivalry bound to end in blood.
You burned the Erd Tree, didn't you? Then the Round Table is soon to follow. No need to fret about that. The Round Table all served to put a Tarnished upon the throne of Elden Lord. And if the Erd Tree needed to burn for that to happen, then the Round Table must go as well. I'll stay at the Round Table for a time. I must learn all that can be taken from this place and sear it into my memory. How could I call myself the All-Knowing if I did any less?
Gideon gained true knowledge after his long exchange with the Two Fingers, discovering all had been broken long ago, that the trembling fingers, bent with age, and the Erd Tree itself were no exception. Knowledge begins with the recognition of one's ignorance, the realization that the search for knowledge is unending. But when Gideon glimpsed into the will of Queen Marika, he shuddered in fear at the end that should not be.
I knew you'd come, to stand before the Elden Ring, to become Elden Lord. What a sad state of affairs. I commend your spirit, but alas, none shall take the throne. Queen Marika has high hopes for us, that we continue to struggle unto eternity.
Perhaps believing himself to be saving the Tarnished from a dishonorable, pointless death, Gideon resolved to confront you, a fellow Tarnished, himself intending to give you a more noble end than the dark abyss he foresaw.
I know, in my bones, a Tarnished cannot become Elden Lord. Not even you. A man cannot kill a god.
Yet, in his arrogance, even the All-Knowing could not see beyond his fear. Despite all his efforts, he was proven wrong. For the Tarnished, of course, went on, prevailing over Radagon and facing the Elden Beast, defying the futility Gideon thought inescapable. In the end, Gideon Ofnir, the man who claimed all knowledge, fell, blinded by the very pursuit he held above all else. And while his actions were marked by blood and betrayal, they reveal him as a man bound to his purpose, driven by a fear that even he, the All-Knowing, could not escape. Mordred's betrayal in Arthurian legend represents the culmination of Camelot's internal decay. As Arthur's illegitimate son, Mordred embodies the consequences of Arthur's own moral failings and the unresolved tensions within the kingdom. His birth is a product of Arthur's incestuous affair with his half-sister Morgott, a transgression that sows the seeds of Camelot's downfall. Mordred's eventual usurpation of the throne is not just an act of rebellion, but a symbolic manifestation of the kingdom's moral corruption. The civil war that ensues, with kin killing kin, is the final, catastrophic result of this deep-seated decay, tearing apart the very fabric of Arthur's once united realm. Mordred's treachery, which pits father against son, serves as the ultimate inversion of the chivalric ideals that Camelot was built upon, highlighting how Arthur's personal failings cascade into a larger catastrophe for the entire kingdom. This narrative finds a parallel in Elden Ring through the shattering of the ring itself, an act of betrayal by Queen Marika that fractures the very order she was meant to uphold. The ensuing civil war among her offspring mirrors the Arthurian civil strife, with each demigod's pursuit of power reflecting the same self-destructive ambition and moral decay that leads to Camelot's fall. However, Elden Ring introduces a complex inversion of this betrayal narrative in the character of Morgott, Marika's illegitimate child. Morgott, born an Omen, marked from birth by horns and twisted features, was both loathed and feared by society, embodying the cursed bloodline of Queen Marika. In the lands between, omens were seen as relics of the Crucible, an ancient, primal force that the Golden Order had long rejected in favor of purity and control. Typically, Omen children born to commoners suffered a cruel fate, mutilated, their horns cut off in a painful ritual meant to cleanse them of their curse. But Morgott, a royal, faced a different punishment. Kept whole, he was forced into a hidden prison deep beneath Leyndell, a ghost among royalty, unseen and unloved. His very existence was denied by his own family and cursed by his blood. Yet, despite this life of rejection and suffering, Morgott did not turn against the order that condemned him. Instead, he became its most fervent defender, devoting his life to upholding the very system that had shunned him. In a tragic twist, Morgott alone among Marika's children remained loyal to the Golden Order, even as the other demigods rose against it in the wake of the Elden Ring's shattering.
Godric the Golden, the twin prodigies, Mikola and Malenia, General Radar, Praetor Rykard, Luna Princess Rani, willful traitors all, thy kind are all of a piece, pillagers, emboldened by the flame of ambition,
Born into a cursed lineage and treated as an abomination, he rose above his suffering, not out of hope for redemption, but from a fierce, tragic love for the Erd Tree and its promise of order. For Morgott, the Golden Order represented something worth fighting for, something higher and more lasting than the ambitions and petty wars of his kin. Though denied grace, Morgott became grace-given by his own determination. Operating under the guise of Morgott, the fell Omen, Morgott took it upon himself to guard the Erd Tree against all comers. As Morgott, he haunted the roads and paths to the Erd Tree, wielding his curse as a weapon to protect the world that scorned him. He fought with unmatched ferocity, slaughtering countless Tarnished and champions who dared to lay claim to the throne. He stood as an unrelenting force, bound by his twisted loyalty, and the rumours of Morgott became a legend, a tale of terror for those who sought the Elden Ring. The Tarnished who encountered Morgott found a horror clad in rags and wielding chains, driven by a purpose as relentless as it was tragic. Morgott became a dark knight of the Golden Order, claiming titles in defiance of his exile. His loyalty was known by many names: the Veiled Monarch, Lord of Leyndell, King of Omens, the last of all kings. Morgott was a defender, not a conqueror. He fought not for power nor for love, as he had never known either. He fought because he alone among Marika's children saw the Erd Tree as sacred, even if it had abandoned him. His unwavering dedication sharply contrasted with the ambition and bitterness that consumed the other demigods, who sought only to take what remained of the Golden Order's power for themselves. In this, Morgott stood as a stark inversion of Mordred from Arthurian legend. Where Mordred rose to betray Camelot and turned father against son, Morgott, though similarly born into rejection and reviled status, chose loyalty over vengeance. He bore no grudge against his family, nor sought power for himself. Instead, he remained bound to his duty. Not out of any hope for acceptance, but out of a pure devotion to the ideals of the Order. His story showed a heroism born not of love or admiration, but of sheer, tragic resolve. A heroism that went unrecognized by the very Order he defended. Morgott's unwavering commitment to a world that abandoned him highlighted a profound and painful nobility. As the Tarnished journeyed toward the Erd Tree and faced him in battle, they encountered not just an enemy, but a tragic guardian whose loyalty, courage, and suffering revealed a depth to the Golden Order that few truly understood.
Foul Tarnished, in search of the Elden Ring, emboldened by the flame of ambition. Someone must extinguish thy flame. Let it be Morgott the Fell.
Morgott's devotion to the Erd Tree was as much an act of defiance as it was of faith, showing that loyalty, even when doomed, was a form of nobility all its own. It was his defiance of fate and refusal to succumb to bitterness that set him apart, and in the end his sacrifice revealed that even in a world ruled by decay and betrayal, true nobility could shine from the most unexpected places.
Tarnished, thou art but a fool. The Erd Tree wards off all who deign approach. We are all forsaken. None may claim the title of Elden Lord.
In Elden Ring, the civil war among Marika's children reflects the destructive nature of ambition and betrayal, much like the strife in Camelot. However, Morgott's story adds a layer of complexity, highlighting the possibility of loyalty and honor, even in the face of rejection and hardship. His tragic fate, fighting alone to protect the Erd Tree against all odds, underscores the harsh reality that, even when one remains true to their ideals, they may still be doomed by the corruption and failings of those around them. Morgott's unwavering dedication to the Golden Order, despite his illegitimacy and the societal scorn he faces, stands as a poignant counterpoint to Mordred's destructive ambition, offering a glimmer of nobility in a world otherwise defined by decay and betrayal. In both narratives, the themes of kin-killing, illegitimacy, and the consequences of familial betrayal are intricately woven into the downfall of great realms. Whether it is Mordred's treachery that brings Camelot to ruin, or Morgott's tragic loyalty that highlights the moral complexities of the lands between, these stories explore the devastating impact of human flaws on the broader world, while also suggesting that individual choices, for good or ill, play a critical role in the ultimate fate of kingdoms. The death of King Arthur marks the end of an era. With his passing, Camelot disintegrates into legend and myth, a kingdom remembered for its lost glory and the flaws that led to its ruin. Arthur's death and the return of Excalibur to the lake symbolize not just the end of a reign, but the dissolution of the magical protection and unity that once defined Camelot. In Elden Ring, the decline of the lands between follows a similar trajectory. The death or defeat of each demigod, and the potential restoration or destruction of the Elden Ring, marks the end of a broken world cycle and the possibility of a new beginning, or a final end. The Tarnished, like Arthur, stands at the precipice of change, with their actions determining the fate of a realm steeped in both greatness and decay. Both the fall of Arthur and Elden Ring explore the impermanence of human endeavours and the fragility of ideals in the face of corruption and moral decay. Through the lens of myth and fantasy, they delve into the complexities of leadership, the consequences of betrayal, and the inevitable decline that follows when the seeds of decay are allowed to take root. In doing so, they remind us that even the most magnificent of kingdoms can crumble when their foundations are built on the flawed nature of humanity. This thematic exploration of decay, whether in the medieval halls of Camelot or the shattered realms of the lands between, offers a timeless reflection on the cyclical nature of rise and fall, unity and division, and the eternal struggle between order and chaos. In his book, The Art of Game Design, Jesse Schell delves into the essence of game design, emphasizing that a game is not merely a collection of rules, graphics, and mechanics, but rather a conduit for creating unique, personal experiences for the player. This idea is particularly resonant when discussing the Souls series, known for its deep, challenging, and often emotionally impactful gameplay. The Souls series, and I'm including Elden Ring, Bloodborne, and Sekiro in this descriptor, is a prime example of how a game's design is intricately tied to the experience it tries to create. Schell argues that the game itself is not the experience, but a medium through which experiences are forged. The Souls series is meticulously crafted to evoke a specific psychological and emotional journey for the player, one of struggle, persistence, and eventual triumph. The world building, lore, level design, and mechanics are all geared towards immersing the player in an experience that feels both personal and profound. One of the most defining features of the Souls series is, of course, its notorious difficulty. At first glance, this might seem like a barrier, something that would alienate players. However, the challenge is central to the experience the game is designed to create. Experiences are unique and unshareable. Each player's journey through a Souls game is deeply personal. The difficulty ensures that every success feels earned, making the experience of overcoming a boss or mastering a complex level intensely rewarding. This emotional payoff is what sticks with the players long after they've put down the controller, and why veterans of the series may even describe the games as comfortable. The Souls series also places a unique emphasis on connection, not just with the game world, but with other players. This is done through the game's multiplayer elements, messages left by other players, ghosts of other players in your world, and the ability to summon help or invade others. These connections, while often fleeting, create a sense of a shared experience in a world that feels otherwise isolating and hostile. No two players can have identical experiences, yet the Souls series allows players to connect and share their individual experiences in a way that feels meaningful. The true measure of a game designer is the quality of the experience they create. The Souls series is remembered and revered not just because of its mechanics or story, but because of the powerful, often unforgettable experiences it creates. Players remember the anxiety of facing a new boss, the exhilaration of victory, and the camaraderie of co-op play. These are the experiences that linger, long after the specifics of the game have faded. In the Souls series, the importance of experience is paramount. The game's design is focused on creating a psychological and emotional journey that is both challenging and rewarding. The connection between players, the difficulty of the game, and the sense of triumph all contribute to an experience that is deeply personal and resonant. As Shell suggests, the game itself is just a means to an end. The true goal is the experience it creates, which is why the Souls series continues to hold a special place in the hearts of its players. The game's director, Miyazaki, has spoken about this reputation for difficulty and reflected on why he thinks it is so important, and how, for Elden Ring in particular, the challenge is integral to the experience. Our general approach to difficulty has, of course, not changed with Elden Ring. We want to create a challenging experience that tests the players and that gives them a feeling of satisfaction and accomplishment when they get through these struggles. However, we do want to stress that there's still a freedom of approach and a breadth of strategies to these encounters, and that means both how you approach them if you want to face these challenges, or come back to them later and circumvent them and find another way around and come back when you're ready. This same philosophy is taken in Shadow of the Erdtree. And after seeing the "you died" screen countless times, finally, the elation of passing the test makes the experience rewarding. It is a far greater dopamine rush than simply killing the boss in a couple of hits when you've had to learn their movesets, understand their weaknesses, and strategize how to defeat them. By forcing the player to think about the game, sit with its bosses, a connection is forged. The game becomes a conversation, a dialogue between the player and the game, not one of language, of sentences and syntax, but one of action and reaction. In most games, combat can often be reduced to a straightforward exercise in pressing buttons to deal damage or perform actions, a monologue, a statement from the player. Now I am become death, the destroyer of worlds. In the Souls series, combat is changed to a form of dialogue. This dialogue isn't conducted with words or text, but through a nuanced and responsive system of action and reaction. Each enemy and boss encounter in a Souls game poses a question or a challenge to the player. Can you overcome this? Have you understood this? Are you aware of your surroundings? The player, in turn, responds through their actions, dodging, parrying, striking, and, sometimes, fleeing. The game speaks through its enemies and bosses, each with their unique patterns, behaviors, and rhythms. The player replies by learning and adapting to these patterns, crafting a strategy that allows them to survive and, eventually, triumph. This creates a feedback loop, where the player's understanding and the game's design are constantly interacting, each influencing the other in a continuous process of learning and adaptation. This process of dialogue through combat expression is where the true satisfaction and psychological reward of the Souls series lie. When a player first encounters a boss, they are likely to die, often repeatedly. Each death is a message from the game. You haven't understood yet. The player is encouraged to return armed with new knowledge and experience gained from each attempt. The act of learning the boss's moveset, recognizing the tells, understanding the timing, and strategizing around weaknesses become a kind of internalized conversation. The game, in essence, is tutoring the player, guiding them towards a deeper understanding of its mechanics and design philosophy. This form of learning creates a sense of mastery that is profoundly satisfying. Unlike games where victories come easily or are based on luck, the Souls series ensures that every victory is earned. This earned victory feels like the culmination of the dialogue, where the player has finally understood the game's language. The dopamine rush of defeating a boss is not merely about the end of a challenge, but the recognition of growth and mastery. The player has learned, adapted, and overcome through persistence and skill. The concept of combat as dialogue is reinforced by the depth and complexity of the Souls series combat system. Weapons in the game are not just tools for damage, they are instruments of expression. A long sword has a different language than a greatsword or a spear. Each weapon type comes with its own set of moves, strengths, weaknesses, and choosing a weapon is akin to choosing how you wish to speak in the game's combat dialogue. The game's design encourages players to experiment and find their own voice. Do you prefer the quick, precise strikes of a rapier, or the slow, devastating blows of a great axe? Each choice alters the flow of combat, changing how you interact with the enemies in the environment. This customization means that each player's experience is unique, further emphasizing that the game's conversation is personal and tailored to the individual's playstyle. Through this ongoing conversation of combat, players begin to understand the game on a level that goes beyond the superficial. It's not just about pressing buttons or memorizing patterns, but about understanding the underlying principles of timing, space, rhythm, and reaction. The Souls series teaches players to be mindful, to observe carefully, to recognize patterns and rhythms, and to act with precision and intent. In doing so, the game fosters a deeper engagement, encouraging players to immerse themselves fully in the experience. This deeper understanding is what makes the Souls series so memorable. The game doesn't just tell a story or present a challenge, it invites players to engage in a dialogue, to learn and grow through repeated interaction. The satisfaction of finally defeating a boss is akin to the satisfaction of having a meaningful conversation where both parties understand each other. It's a moment of clarity and connection that leaves a lasting impact. Before Demon's Souls came out, both Sony and players would have thought, what the hell is he talking about? Death as education. What is he thinking? But now everybody is fully aware of the concept. The main concept behind the death system is trial and error. The difficulty is high, but always achievable. Everyone can achieve without all that much technique. All you need to do is learn from your deaths how to overcome the difficulties. Overcoming challenges by learning something in a game is a very rewarding feeling, and that's what I want to prioritize in Dark Souls and Demon's Souls. And because of the online gameplay systems, you can even learn something from somebody else's death. I'd say that was the main concept behind the online aspects too. The Souls games, Demon's Souls, Dark Souls, Bloodborne, Sekiro, and Elden Ring have cultivated a unique place in the gaming world, but not just because of their challenging gameplay or intricate lore, but because of the shared sense of community they inspire. The difficulty of these games acts as a crucible, forging connections among players who come together to share strategies, celebrate victories, and commiserate over losses. This shared trial and accomplishment have created a thriving community that is an essential part of the Souls game's success. One of the most compelling aspects of getting into the Souls games is discovering the vibrant and dedicated community that forms around each title. As players dive into the games, they quickly find themselves in a collective endeavor, seeking to unravel the deep mysteries and complex systems that define these worlds. Jordan Palethorpe, a producer for the Engagement Lab at Emerson College, captures this phenomenon well. Dark Souls isn't didactic in its design. It clearly has ideal paths and playthroughs, but it expects you to find them and learn how to master them. It effectively creates a discourse community and brings others together to figure out how to pass its systems. The Souls games create a space where players are not just engaging with the game but also with each other. While some may perceive this community as insular or elitist, Palethorpe suggests this as a misconception. He points out that the real strength of the Souls community lies in its inclusivity and collaboration. Sure, there are those who identify as hardcore gamers and feel Dark Souls validates their misguided elitist perspective, but I think that's a very minor group. I think the majority who appreciate these games do so because it forces people to talk to each other. The game intentionally creates a viral moment of interest, where everyone is trying to pass the game together, to uncover mechanical secrets and share strategies for progressing that would be incredibly difficult to do alone. This sense of shared discovery and support is not incidental, but is an intentional design choice by Miyazaki. In an early interview with Miyazaki, he recounted the origin of Demon's Souls' unusual multiplayer mechanics. He recalled an experience during a winter car ride when several cars, including his own, got stuck on a hill. It was only when everyone worked together, pushing each car to the top one by one, that they were able to make it through. This connection of mutual assistance between transient people became a guiding principle for the multiplayer aspects of the Souls games. These moments of fleeting beauty and camaraderie are also present in Elden Ring, where players find themselves in a harsh, unforgiving world, and moments of respite and cooperation are rare, and thus more precious. The game's design encourages these transient connections. Whether it's summoning a stranger to help defeat a daunting boss, or leaving messages that guide others through a perilous path. I am sure that there is some experience, if you look deep enough into my history, that has informed my identity, the worldview that drives me to make the games that I do, Miyazaki reflects. This ethos of connection through adversity is woven into the fabric of each game, creating a shared experience that is as much about the players' relationships with each other as it is about their relationship with the game itself. Of course, this is not unique to the Souls games. Halo Reach, for example, is cherished not just for its mechanics and story, but for the community experiences it fostered. Friends coming together, creating special memories, and sharing in the narrative of hope and sacrifice. In the same way, the Souls games are elevated by the communal efforts of their players, who come together to conquer challenges that would be insurmountable alone. Video games, like films or any other art form, have the power to connect people. Just as watching a film in a packed cinema enhances the experience through collective gasps and laughter, so too does playing a Souls game with a community, whether it's through direct interaction or shared stories, enhancing the emotional and intellectual journey. The Souls games exemplify how a shared sense of community transform a difficult, solitary journey into a profound collective experience. Through their design, these games challenge players not just to overcome obstacles, but to reach out, connect, and find meaning in shared struggle and success. This community is not just a byproduct of the game's difficulty, but a core element of what makes the Souls series resonate so deeply with so many. Video games, like all forms of art, are not, should not, and cannot be made to appeal to everyone. This is especially true for the Souls series, which has crafted a distinct identity around its unyielding difficulty and atmospheric storytelling. There are plenty of people who, for any number of reasons, will bounce off these games, despite their qualities. Elden Ring stands as an impressive achievement in the world of video games, with its expansive open world and deep lore, building upon the legacy of the Souls series. However, what sets Dark Souls, Demon Souls, and their kin apart from many of their peers, including Elden Ring in my view, is their unwavering commitment to difficulty as a core design philosophy. The difficulty is high but always achievable. Everyone can achieve without all that much technique. All you need to do is learn, from your deaths, how to overcome the difficulties. Overcoming challenges by learning something in a game is a very rewarding feeling, and that's what I want to prioritize in Dark Souls and Demon Souls. Miyazaki's words encapsulate the philosophy behind the Souls games. The challenge presented by these games is not arbitrary, it's purposeful. The world of Dark Souls is one of significant challenge, and the friction the player feels mirrors the harsh and unforgiving nature of the game's universe. This parallel creates a deeper thematic resonance. Players are not just observing a world of struggle, they are actively participating in it. By repeatedly facing and overcoming adversity, the players embody the very essence of the stories being told, stories of perseverance, resilience, and the indomitable spirit. Difficulty in the Souls games also foster a profound psychological impact. Each death is a lesson, an opportunity to grow and learn. This process of trial, error, and eventual triumph is a powerful feedback loop that generates a strong sense of accomplishment and satisfaction. The difficulty is not a barrier but a pathway to a deeper emotional experience. It is through this crucible of challenge that players forge a stronger connection to the game, its world, and its characters. This connection is something that transcends mere entertainment. It becomes a shared journey of endurance and discovery. Moreover, the steep difficulty of the games has birthed a unique and dedicated community. Players come together to share their strategies, offer encouragement, and celebrate victories. The communal aspect of overcoming a shared challenge is integral to the Souls experience. The game's difficulty is a rallying cry, creating a sense of camaraderie among players who might otherwise be complete strangers. This collective effort to tackle the game's formidable challenges together amplifies the sense of accomplishment and belonging. But with Elden Ring, this idea has become lost. When discussing difficulty in video games, we find ourselves wading into the deep waters of subjectivity. What is challenging to one player may be effortless to another, and what feels like a fair obstacle for one can be an insurmountable barrier for someone else. This section of the video series is dedicated to a nuanced exploration of why the difficulty in Elden Ring doesn't quite resonate with me personally. It's crucial to acknowledge up front that this perspective is inherently subjective and may not align with everyone's experience. Yet that very subjectivity is the essence of this conversation. So, do I think Elden Ring is too hard? Not exactly. It's a complex answer that spans both yes and no. For context, I have completed every boss, from the main storyline to the most hidden optional encounters in both the base game and Shadow of the Erdtree. My critique isn't rooted in an inability to overcome these challenges. Instead, it stems from a deeper reflection on how the game's difficulty is constructed and implemented. Difficulty in Elden Ring isn't just a single monolithic concept. It's a multifaceted experience crafted through a combination of mechanics, stamina management, player movement, enemy behavior, damage calculations, and more. These elements interlock to form a tapestry designed to challenge the player in various ways. Ideally, these systems should be in harmony, each aspect balancing the others to create a cohesive experience. However, in Elden Ring, I found that these elements too often clash or become misaligned, resulting in an experience that feels uneven and frustrating. Difficulty is, by its nature, subjective. Elden Ring's difficulty may be perfectly calibrated for some players, offering a satisfying blend of challenge and reward, but for others, for me, the balance tips too far, creating frustration rather than fulfillment. This variance in experience is not just a matter of skill or perseverance, it's about how different players interact with the game's systems. For me, certain aspects of Elden Ring's difficulty feel inconsistent and unfair, not because they are impossible to overcome, but because the design choices obscure rather than illuminate the path forward, too often relying on frustration. Earlier I described the Souls formula as a conversation between game and player, an intricate back and forth where the game asks questions through its challenges, its enemies, its puzzles, and I, as the player, answer through my actions. Each roll, each perfectly timed swing of the sword, each stat point carefully placed in leveling up my character, these are my responses in the dialogue. In Dark Souls, this conversation feels deliberate, measured. The game poses its questions thoughtfully, and allows me the space to think, adapt, and respond. But in Elden Ring, that conversation has devolved into something far more chaotic, no longer a dialogue, but a shouting match. The game hurls its challenges at me, faster, more relentless, as if in a fit of rage. Bosses, all murderous speed and overwhelming force, scream their demands with little regard for the measured pace of prior Souls titles. My only response is to scream back, matching the game's intensity with brute force and frantic action, abandoning the careful dance that once defined the series. The subtlety of the conversation is lost, replaced by a desperate struggle to keep up with a game that no longer listens, only shouts. To illustrate this point, let's consider the words of Miyazaki himself. In an interview with Famitsu around the release of Demon Souls, Miyazaki described his philosophy of fair challenge. It's a difficult game, and you end up getting defeated a lot, so we try to make sure that the reason you get defeated isn't the game's fault. If you're going to get defeated, we want it to be because of the player. Otherwise, the player won't want to grow or think about it. It's unfair to die because of the game or the system. It's also not good to win by chance. We try not to make it something like, you can win if you keep trying. If we don't make it clear in the game that it's your fault that you fell, then it's not right to say that the controls are difficult, that you were defeated because it was unfair, or that you were defeated because of a 1 in 100 critical hit. We pay attention to that. It's a way to make sure that even if you get defeated, you don't get discouraged and you keep trying. But it was an essential part. Miyazaki's approach emphasizes the player's role in overcoming adversity, ensuring that success or failure feels earned rather than something arbitrary. But what happens when this philosophy isn't consistently applied? In Elden Ring, there are moments where the design seems to falter, where the challenge feels less like a fair test of skill and more like an opaque obstacle. This can occur through a variety of mechanisms, such as unclear enemy animations, unpredictable damage spikes, or mechanics that feel more punishing than instructive. The game's approach to difficulty is somewhat rigid, the lack of adjustable difficulty settings means that every player must face the same baseline challenge, regardless of their personal preferences or capabilities. This one-size-fits-all approach ignores the vast diversity of player experiences. Some might find satisfaction in the game's most punishing aspects, while others might crave a more forgiving journey that still offers meaningful challenge. By not providing these options, Elden Ring risks alienating players who could otherwise find enjoyment in its world. Consider, for example, a game like Star Wars Jedi Survivor. This game, often compared to a Souls-like title, offers a range of difficulty settings that allow the player to tailor their experience. On Grandmaster difficulty, I find the game provides a demanding but fair challenge, while my partner prefers Jedi Knight difficulty for a more balanced experience that is challenging without being overwhelming. Both of us have managed to find joy and satisfaction in our respective modes, underscoring the idea that difficulty is not a universal experience. It is personal and shaped by the interplay between game design and player preference. The beauty of a game like this lies in its capacity to provoke strong reactions, push players to reflect on their own skills, strategies, and resilience, and it's worth noting that any way of playing the game, whether using summons, magic, heavy weaponry, or quick-footed dodges, is legitimate if it brings enjoyment. Ultimately, these are games, and the primary goal should always be to have fun. However, when analysing the difficulty of Elden Ring, it's essential to recognise the ways in which the game systems sometimes work against the player's enjoyment, rather than enhancing it. Difficulty, when implemented thoughtfully, should be an enabler of deeper engagement, not a barrier to it. Yet in Elden Ring, there are times when difficulty feels more like a wall than a doorway. It's these moments of dissonance that I wish to explore in this section. So, with this context in mind, let's take a deeper dive into the specific areas where I believe Elden Ring's difficulty misses the mark, starting with visual clarity and intention. How do these elements impact the player's ability to navigate the game's challenges, and where do they fall short? Let's explore this further. I want to start with a relatively simple element, by exploring how visual clutter and obscure mechanics can artificially inflate perceived difficulty, to the detriment of player engagement. Let's begin with a fundamental principle in game design, visual clarity. In a well-crafted game, players should be able to understand their environment and the challenges they face intuitively. Elden Ring, however, often veers away from this path. The game introduces a series of elements that cloud this clarity, making encounters feel less about skillful mastery and more about endurance and gear management. Consider the boss battles in Elden Ring. These encounters are notorious for their unpredictable attack patterns and complex movesets. Unlike in earlier FromSoftware titles, where bosses had more discernible attack rhythms, Elden Ring's bosses often rely on erratic and extended attack sequences. This unpredictability forces players into a passive role, observing rather than engaging, waiting for the right moment that may never come. Instead of feeling like a rewarding dance between player and enemy, these battles feel like watching a chaotic firework display, where the rules are ever changing. There's the issue of delayed attacks, designed to punish players for panic rolling or dodging too hastily. These moves can teach valuable lessons about patience and timing. However, in Elden Ring they often clash with the relentless onslaught of multi-hit combos, leading to a combat experience that feels less like a learning curve and more like a guessing game. When delayed attacks are layered on top of extended combos and overwhelming visual effects, they contribute to a sense of unfairness, rather than fostering the satisfaction that comes from overcoming a clear and understandable challenge. One of the striking aspects of Elden Ring is the lack of a sense of physics and the movement of many of its larger bosses. Watching something like Morgott, Malekith, the Godskin Noble, or the ulcerated tree spirits leap at lightning speeds without taking breaks is both frustrating and incredulous. Despite their massive size, these bosses often leap around the battlefield with surprising speed and agility that defy their weight and scale. This creates a visual dissonance as their movements seem impractical and disconnected from their apparent mass. This stands in stark contrast to the Dark Souls series, where larger enemies embody their size with weighty, deliberate actions. These enemies move slowly, but their attacks are devastating if they connect, giving players a chance to anticipate and react. Enemies like the Gaping Dragon embody this philosophy. In Elden Ring, however, the physics-defying agility of some of the bosses undermines the sense of immersion and make battles feel less grounded and more unpredictable, sacrificing the tactical clarity that defined the Souls games. This brings us to a critical point: fairness in game mechanics. In Elden Ring, enemies do not seem to operate under the same rules as the player. Stamina, a core mechanic that limits the player's actions, appears to be a non-issue for bosses and other enemies. They launch continuous attacks with little to no downtime, never needing to pause for breath or reconsider their strategy. This discrepancy creates a feeling of imbalance, where the player is held to a different standard than that of their adversaries. To see what fair difficulty could look like, I'd like to turn to Sekiro. In Sekiro, both the player and the enemies adhere to the same rules regarding stamina and posture. Every action has a consequence, and this parity creates a more transparent and fair combat system. Players know that if they can manage their stamina and maintain their posture, they can outlast their opponent, and vice versa. It's a dance of precision and skill, where every move matters and every mistake is a learning opportunity. Contrast this with Elden Ring's approach to poise damage and stance breaking. In theory, this system adds depth to the combat, rewarding players for breaking an enemy's stance. However, the mechanics behind poise damage are shrouded in mystery. Each weapon and attack type deals an invisible amount of poise damage, but the game never really explains this to the player. Without clear feedback, players are often left wondering if their efforts to break an enemy's stance are having any effect at all. This lack of communication leads to frustration, as I feel disconnected from the mechanics that should be enhancing my combat experience. It's worth comparing this to another modern Souls-like title, Lords of the Fallen from 2023, which offers a more intuitive approach to similar mechanics. In Lords of the Fallen, the stagger system is clearly communicated to the player through visual cues, making it easy to understand and engage with. This transparency encourages players to experiment with different strategies and rewards them for mastering the mechanics, creating a more satisfying gameplay loop. Elden Ring's issues with clarity don't really end with poise damage though. The parry mechanic, a hallmark of the Souls series, feels oddly implemented in this game. In titles like Bloodborne and Sekiro, parrying is a high-risk, high-reward action, essential for success, and deeply integrated into the combat flow. In Elden Ring, however, parrying often feels disconnected from the rest of the combat system. The timing is tighter, the payoff is lower, and many bosses cannot be parried at all. This inconsistency creates a trial-and-error scenario that feels arbitrary and unintuitive. At a conceptual level, it seems to exist somewhat within what Jason Schell describes as triangularity. One of the most exciting and interesting choices for a player to make is whether to play it safe and go for a small reward, or take a big risk to try for a big reward. This is a hard decision to make if the game is balanced properly. I find that about 8 out of 10 times someone comes to me asking for help on a game prototype that just isn't fun. The game is missing this kind of meaningful choice. You could call this balanced asymmetric risk, since you are balancing a low risk with low reward against a high risk with a high reward, but that is kind of a mouthful. This relationship comes up so often and is so important that I like to give it a shorter name: triangularity. The player is one point of the triangle, the low risk choice is the second part, and the high risk choice is the third. If parrying in Elden Ring is meant to add an element of triangularity, where players weigh the risks and rewards of a given action, it falls short of its potential. In theory, parrying should be a meaningful choice, a high-risk action that offers a substantial reward if executed correctly. But in practice, the lack of visual cues and the minimal reward make it an option many players avoid. Why would I risk a difficult parry when dodging or blocking is a safer option, and just as effective? This undermines the very essence of triangularity, reducing what could be a dynamic choice into a less appealing option. This is all compounded by the player's base toolkit, something I'll come to later in the video. We also see a stark contrast in how visual feedback is handled between Elden Ring and Sekiro. In Sekiro, unblockable attacks are clearly telegraphed with symbols, giving players a chance to react appropriately. Whether by jumping to avoid a sweep, using a Makiri counter to a thrust, or sidestepping a grab. This system not only adds depth to the combat, but also provides players with a sense of agency. They understand what's coming and can prepare accordingly. Elden Ring lacks this clarity. The absence of such telegraphs turns many encounters into a game of trial and error, where learning feels less like a reward and more like a punishment. As a final thought, let's consider the potential for more dynamic visual storytelling in boss fights. Elden Ring could benefit from borrowing a page from games like Monster Hunter, where enemies show visible signs of weakening, or from its own predecessors in the Souls series. Imagine if, in Elden Ring, bosses reacted to the player's actions in more meaningful ways, perhaps limping, or becoming more desperate as their health dwindles. Maybe they could even flee, forcing players to pursue them across a sprawling landscape, turning each encounter into a dynamic, evolving narrative. Dark Souls has, of course, experimented with this to greater and lesser extents throughout the years. Sif and Ceaseless Discharge in Dark Souls 1, the Old Demon King in Dark Souls 3, and it's a shame to see these creative flourishes disappear over time. This kind of design would not only enhance the game's visual storytelling, but also provide a clearer sense of progression and accomplishment. Ultimately, the challenge in a game like Elden Ring should stem from mastering its systems and mechanics, not from contending with unclear visuals and obscure rules. A well-designed difficulty curve respects the player's intelligence, offering a fair, yet demanding experience that rewards skill, strategy, and perseverance. Elden Ring's reliance on visual clutter and inconsistent mechanics risks undermining this delicate balance, creating moments of frustration rather than triumph. To start this section, a question for you. Upon leaving the stranded graveyard, which path did you set off on? Did you do as you were told by the first NPC you saw, reinforced by the path drawn by each of the sites of grace you came across towards Stormveil Castle itself? Or perhaps, were you drawn toward the Great Lake, where you challenged a powerful dragon, explored the ruins, and discovered a chest that teleported you to a nightmarish dimension? Maybe you actively ignored the game's guidance entirely and headed south, across a heavily guarded bridge, to reclaim a legendary armament far beyond your character's current capabilities. My point is this. Challenge and balance in an open world structure. How do you account for the many directions a player is presented with when entering the game? Let's get into this. How do you balance difficulty in a game where the player can go almost anywhere, anytime? How do you ensure that a player who meticulously explores every corner of the map doesn't become overleveled, trivializing challenges through sheer power rather than any skill? Conversely, how do you encourage exploration without forcing it, maintaining a pace that feels organic to each individual player? The answer, unfortunately, seems to be that you can't really achieve that balance with the systems Elden Ring has inherited from Dark Souls 3. Unlike traditional games that rely heavily on cutscenes or direct exposition, the Souls series chooses a different path. A path defined by environmental storytelling, where every shadow, ruin, and whispered wind is laden with meaning. In these dark, foreboding worlds, explicit storytelling takes a back seat after the initial setup. The opening moments may introduce players to the grand themes or the key players in the narrative, but soon after the hand-holding stops. Players are left to piece together the story through their own exploration, interpretation, and imagination. This is where environmental storytelling truly shines, an art that FromSoftware has honed to near perfection. Environmental storytelling in the Souls series is an intricate dance between design and player agency. Every aspect of the game's world, from the architecture and enemy placement to the haunting music and atmospheric lighting, conveys a sense of history, purpose, and foreboding. These elements are not mere backdrops, they are the story. The decaying castles, the twisted forests, and the desolate wastelands all tell tales of their own, inviting players to uncover the mysteries buried within. The genius of this approach lies in its subtlety. Unlike the more traditional narrative methods that can interrupt gameplay, cutscenes, lengthy dialogues, environmental storytelling allows the game's pace to remain uninterrupted. Players are constantly active, not just physically maneuvering their characters, but also mentally engaging with the world around them. They're not passive recipients of the story. They are its active participants, piecing together the lore through careful observation and exploration. This method of storytelling also opens up a space for interpretation, a canvas for the player's imagination. In the Souls series, no detail is accidental. From the descriptions of items to the architecture of forgotten ruin, every element is meticulously crafted to contribute to the narrative. Yet, there is an intentional ambiguity, a deliberate withholding of full explanations. This ambiguity is not a shortcoming, but of course a strength. It invites players to fill in the gaps with their own interpretations, to become co-authors of the story. This approach comes with its challenges. The balance between clarity and mystery is delicate. Designers must craft a world that is internally consistent, where every symbol and motif aligns with the game's overarching themes, yet open enough to allow for diverse interpretations. Cultural and personal differences will inevitably colour how players perceive the game's narrative, making it crucial for the creators to maintain a harmonious and consistent tone throughout. The Souls series, with its meticulously constructed universe, achieves this balance with remarkable skill. Drawing on mythological motifs and familiar archetypes, knights, dragons, sorcery, FromSoftware builds worlds that are both familiar and alien, grounded in shared imagery, yet brimming with original, unsettling details. The consistency and depth of these worlds allows players to delve deeper, to uncover the story at their own pace, and to invest their interpretations without ever breaking the immersion. The Souls games offer a unique kind of freedom. A freedom born from the interplay between a richly detailed world and the player's own imagination. This is the true power of environmental storytelling. The ability to create a narrative that is not just experienced, but lived, as players wander through these desolate landscapes, deciphering the forgotten past and shaping their own understanding of the world they inhabit. Think back to Dark Souls with me for a moment, to one of its most controversial, iconic early areas, Blighttown. Usually found before you have access to fast travel, once you traverse down, you are trapped in the dark, dank sewers. You may not see the sun again for hours. The way forward is a dark, impenetrable maze of obfuscating infrastructure, resisting your attempts to memorize its twisting structures. From the dark, deadly darts of toxic concoctions bombard you while you contend with giants, swinging their deadly clubs. But gravity is an even greater threat on uneven walkways. Hellhounds give chase as you rush towards that bonfire in the distance, itself a trap. Once you rest here, you're locked into this path. You can't go back to the safety and comfort of the violent shrine. You must now battle your way to the base, a poisonous swamp infested with engorged insects. The relief at finding that bonfire tucked away in a small tunnel at the bottom, the briefest of respites before your final challenge in the area. The spider-infused fire witch, Quelaag. Quelaag may seem quaint by the standards of bosses in Elden Ring, but she doesn't need to be overwhelming. She is the cherry on top of an excellent gauntlet challenge of an area, with interesting story and lore connotations. The whole area leaves an indelible impression on you that lingers in the mind long after the controller has been set aside. She is iconic not for her difficulty, but for the context in which she is placed. In contrast, Elden Ring's open world, with its frequent checkpoints and ability to walk freely from the start, shifts the focus away from such forced engagements, challenged through level design. This design places a heavy emphasis on the boss fights alone, which, while challenging of course, becomes monotonous when not balanced by a sense of meaningful progression and discovery throughout the world. Deep exploration of the game's numerous caves, catacombs, and cliffs often feels like an exercise in futility. Many enemies and bosses in these areas yield minimal rewards, often repeated, and they diminish the player's sense of achievement, rendering the challenge less satisfying. In Dark Souls and Bloodborne, FromSoftware mastered a form of game design that I'd call wide linear. These games provided a mostly linear path from start to finish, yet gave players the freedom to explore a few optional routes, find hidden shortcuts, and return to earlier areas with new capabilities. This design struck a perfect balance. It created the illusion of expansive worlds, while maintaining tight control over the player's progression, challenge, and the sense of exploration. In Dark Souls, you always felt like you were seeing the tip of an iceberg, a tip with much below the surface, if only you could get at it. FromSoftware could always know with confidence how strong or weak a player might be in a given area, and they could tailor the combat and enemies accordingly. This ensured that the difficulty felt fair, but always challenging, no matter when the player arrived. Elden Ring, of course, marks a dramatic shift from this formula. No longer confined to wide linear corridors, players now roam a vast, open world. While this new freedom brings opportunities for emergent gameplay and exploration, it presents a challenge for the traditional Souls-like difficulty curve. Elden Ring's world is massive and unstructured, and because players can venture almost anywhere at any time, the developers can no longer predict when a player might arrive at a specific boss or area. As a result, the difficulty curve becomes far less predictable and more variable than in previous Souls titles. In these games, enemies and bosses have fixed stats, health, damage, movesets, no matter when the player encounters them. This works well in a structured game where progression is more controlled, but in Elden Ring it starts to fall apart. Take Morgott, the Fell Omen, the first major boss in the game and a crucial test for many players. Like previous Souls games, Morgott's difficulty is fixed. His stats won't change regardless of how much the player has explored or leveled up before facing him. This method worked beautifully in more linear designs. In the open world structure of Elden Ring, it introduces problems that risk the balance of the entire experience. Because Elden Ring doesn't give explicit cues about which areas are right for the player's current level, two players could have wildly different experiences. One player may stumble upon Morgott far too early, underleveled and underprepared, and find the fight almost impossibly hard. They deal little damage, take too much in return, and may conclude that they're just not skilled enough for the game. Compounding this issue is that the regular enemies leading up to Morgott don't give much of an indication that the player is underleveled for that particular area, unlike the brutal skeleton graveyard in Dark Souls 1, which clearly signals you're not ready for this yet if you can't tackle the most basic enemies. Morgott's surrounding guards are far easier to defeat, giving players a false sense of preparedness for the boss fight. This creates a frustrating disconnect, and almost derailed my first playthrough of the game. Elden Ring's reputation for difficulty, inherited from the Souls series, may cause a new player to think, well, this boss is supposed to be this hard, rather than realizing they're in the wrong place at the wrong time. Without clear guidance, this player might give up on the game entirely, feeling defeated not by the boss, but by the game's ambiguity. There is a simple way the game could address this issue without breaking its design philosophy. Melina, the mysterious guide who appears occasionally to help the player, could be used more effectively. Imagine if, after a few deaths to a boss like Morgott, Melina appeared at a site of grace to suggest, in her own subtle way, that perhaps there's a different place worth exploring first. This gentle nudge would serve as a natural extension of her role as a guide, without holding the player's hand too tightly. It's an approach the game already hints at with developer messages in certain areas, but Melina's presence would feel a bit more organic and immersive. By giving players these subtle hints, the game could still preserve its challenging reputation while also preventing frustration for newcomers. It would encourage exploration without punishing players for simply wandering too far, too soon. On the flip side of all this, another player might face Morgott far too late, having overleveled through extensive exploration of other areas. By the time they reach Morgott, they might breeze through the fight, rendering what should have been a memorable and intense encounter anticlimactic. This undermines one of the core pillars of FromSoftware's design: carefully crafted, meaningful challenge. Unintentionally, this second player has diminished the intended difficulty by doing exactly what the game encourages: exploring. But the problem here is that in a game like Elden Ring, there's no clear indication of when a player has over-prepared. Exploration is meant to be rewarded, but in this case, it backfires, depriving players of the satisfaction of overcoming a hard-fought boss battle. Worse still, this pattern can create a disincentive to explore further, as players may fear trivializing future bosses, and thus miss out on some of the game's most exciting, optional content. The core problem here is that Elden Ring wants to encourage players to explore its vast, rich world, but the fixed difficulty scaling of bosses means that exploration leads to wildly inconsistent experiences. In some areas, players will find themselves woefully underleveled, while in others, they will crush enemies with little effort. The lack of a clear progression path leaves players unsure of when they've done enough exploring, which leads to that sense of imbalance. In many ways, Elden Ring is caught between two conflicting ideas. On one hand, it's an open-world game that rewards curiosity and exploration. On the other, it's built on a foundation of finely tuned, skill-based combat where difficulty plays a central role. Striking a balance between these two pillars is tricky, of course. But, in many cases, the game structure leaves players adrift, not knowing when they're too strong or too weak for the challenges ahead. Elden Ring highlights the challenge of designing a truly open-world game that still preserves the essence of what makes Souls games so beloved. The fixed difficulty system, while effective in the linear environments of Dark Souls, leads to inconsistent experiences in the sprawling, unpredictable world of Elden Ring. The beauty of the Souls series has always been in its carefully crafted challenges and the satisfaction of mastering them, but in an open-world setting, without careful guidance or clearer progression markers, players either find themselves overwhelmed or overpowered, losing that delicate balance that makes FromSoftware games so compelling. For an open-world game, it should never feel like exploring too much is a problem. The balance between freedom and challenge is delicate, but with a bit more in-game guidance and an awareness of how exploration impacts difficulty, Elden Ring could become the best of both worlds, a sprawling open adventure that still delivers the precise, challenging gameplay that fans have come to expect. Neither of these situations, leveling too much and leveling too little, are great in relation to Elden Ring's difficulty system, and the Goldilocks path, not too hard, not too easy, just right, is taken out of the player's hands. Other games do not work this way. Take Elder Scrolls as an example. Here, enemies scale based on the player level. Dynamic level scaling in Skyrim is a core mechanic that is intended to ensure enemies and challenges remain relevant and engaging throughout the game. This system adapts the strength of enemies to match the player's overall level, providing a tailored experience. Skyrim is divided into various regions, dungeons, and quest areas. Each of these has a defined level range that dictates the minimum and maximum levels enemies can scale to within that area. Some areas are set to match the player's level directly, while others have fixed levels or caps to maintain specific challenge levels. As a general rule of thumb, the farther from the center you explore, the harder the game will feel. Different variants of enemies appear based on the player's level. For instance, low-level players might encounter basic bandits, while high-level players will face bandit chiefs or marauders. Most common enemies in the game, such as bandits, Draugr, and wolves, have several variants that are introduced at specific player levels. For example, Draugr have multiple forms, basic at low levels, while stronger versions like Scourges and Deathlords appear as the player levels up. And in general, certain enemy types will always start at a level beyond that of a player, such as giants and dragons. Typically, enemies and loot are selected from leveled lists, which adjust the type and strength of encounters based on the player's level. These lists ensure a variety of challenges and rewards appropriate to the player's progression. But there are instances of dungeons and camps that have their own scaling. Certain boss enemies and unique foes have fixed levels or level ranges. These are designed to be challenging regardless of the player's progression. Dragons, for instance, have several tiers, such as blood dragons, elder dragons, and ancient dragons that appear as the player levels up, each with increasing difficulty. Each zone in Skyrim has a defined level range and scaling factor. When a player first enters a zone, the game sets the level of the enemies based on the player's current level within that range. While scaling ensures challenges remain appropriate, there are limits to prevent enemies from becoming overwhelmingly difficult or trivially easy. Certain high difficulty areas like Solstheim from the Dragonborn DLC have higher minimum levels to provide late game challenges. Conversely, starting areas like Riverwood have lower maximum levels to ease new players into the game. Now, this system has its own flaws, of course. Typically, the player does plateau in terms of a power fantasy. They can actually fall victim to the scaling. Say you want to roleplay in that game, primarily as a smith or a potion crafter. Basically anything that is not going to increase your power in combat. Your overall level will still be climbing by improving those non-combat skills, meaning enemies become stronger than you can possibly achieve. Suddenly, bandit camps, Draugr dungeons, and random encounters on the road are filled with multiple marauders, death lords, night walkers, despite it not necessarily making sense for there to be such high-level enemies in that place. This makes traversal more difficult in the later stages of the game if you haven't invested skill points into the combat trees. Now, you wouldn't know this would be the case upon first playthrough. All this is to say there is a happy medium, but in order to reach it, a player has to play in a very meta or self-aware way, which does not lend itself well in a role-playing game. Speaking of an open-world game, Elden Ring faces a unique challenge: the ability for players to simply bypass enemy encounters altogether. This is especially evident in the overworld, where the freedom provided by the game's expansive landscapes and the use of Torrent, your trusty spectral steed, allows you to skirt around almost any fight. Whether it's a lone knight patrolling a bridge or a cluster of enemies guarding a chest, most overworld combat scenarios can be easily avoided if the player so chooses. The Souls series has always been known for its intricate level design, challenging combat, and richly detailed worlds. With Elden Ring, FromSoftware introduced an open world element, promising a departure from the more linear paths of its predecessors in Dark Souls. At first glance, this open world appears vast and filled with opportunities for exploration, allowing players to chart their own course and carve out their own unique adventures. However, upon closer inspection, the structure of Elden Ring reveals significant limitations that mirror the more linear progression of Dark Souls. Let's take some time to explore how Elden Ring's open world, in practice, lacks true openness, and functions more as a series of interconnected, linear paths with limited freedom for genuine deviation. The term open world often evokes images of boundless freedom, where a player can go anywhere, do anything, and shape their journey according to their preferences and playstyle. Elden Ring certainly offers an expansive landscape filled with secrets, enemies, and treasures, but this openness is more of an illusion than a reality. The game's design subtly guides players along a mostly predetermined path, akin to the way Dark Souls directs players through its more compact environments. The criticism here is that, while players can theoretically explore areas like Liurnia or the College of Glintstone Mages early on, they are heavily discouraged from doing so. This discouragement doesn't come in the form of explicit barriers or lock gates, but through the game's underlying mechanics, such as enemy difficulty, scaling, and resource distribution. If a player attempts to venture into high-level areas too soon, they will likely find themselves overwhelmed by the difficulty spike. Conversely, if they remain in early areas for too long, they risk becoming overleveled and trivializing future encounters, leading to a less rewarding experience. In theory, the open world of Elden Ring should allow players to pursue their desired playstyle more freely, whether that involves becoming a powerful mage, a nimble rogue, or a heavily armored knight. Due to the game's underlying design philosophy and the fear of creating extreme power imbalances, players are often funneled into a more restrictive path. For instance, for that player that is interested in magic, they might logically want to rush to Liurnia in the College of the Glintstone Mages, to acquire advanced spells and equipment early on. Yet, many of the powerful spells in the game are not immediately available there, and even those that are, can be underwhelming until much later in the game. This design choice effectively forces players into a more linear progression, mirroring the structure of Dark Souls. In both games, while exploration is possible, the most efficient or viable path is often a narrow one. The open world of Elden Ring might be visually and thematically expansive, but the actual freedom to craft a unique gameplay experience is limited by the way resources, enemies, and challenges are distributed throughout the world. Elden Ring's world, despite its vastness, is structurally similar to the interconnected, albeit more linear worlds of Dark Souls. In Dark Souls, while players could technically choose different routes, certain paths were clearly designed to be tackled in a specific order based on difficulty and the availability of key items and abilities. For example, one could attempt to explore New Londo ruins early, but without the right equipment or upgrades, it would be nearly impossible to make any progression. Similarly, in Elden Ring, areas like the Volcano Manor on Mount Gilmir, or the many underground areas throughout the world serve as optional side content, rather than truly viable alternatives to the main path. These regions are reminiscent of side areas like Cainhurst Castle in Bloodborne, areas that provide depth and richness to the game world but ultimately exist as offshoots from the main narrative and progression path. They offer rewards and lore, but don't significantly alter the player's overall journey or provide a truly open-ended experience. A more genuinely open-world Elden Ring could leverage its large cast of characters and NPCs to create a more dynamic and player-driven experience. Characters like Gideon, who currently serves mainly as a lore repository for key bosses, could be repurposed to provide meaningful guidance and support, tailored to the player's interests and playstyle choices. Imagine a version of Elden Ring where Gideon and other NPCs offer hints, side quests, or equipment that directly align with the player's chosen path, be it sorcery, melee combat, or stealth. In this reimagined Elden Ring, the open world could feel truly open, with multiple viable paths to powerful spells, unique weapons, and character builds. Players would not be bound by the fear of breaking the game's difficulty curve, but would instead be encouraged to explore and experiment, crafting a unique journey that reflects their personal preferences and playstyle. This approach would make the vastness of the world meaningful, turning every corner into a potential opportunity for character development, rather than just a challenge to be tackled in the prescribed order. While Elden Ring presents itself as an open-world evolution of the Souls formula, in practice it remains more closely aligned with the linear progression of its predecessors. The game structure, designed to maintain a balanced difficulty curve, limits the player's true freedom to explore and experiment. This leads to an experience that, while expansive, is not as open-ended as it initially appears. By rethinking how progression, difficulty, and NPC interactions are handled, Elden Ring could more fully realize its potential as a truly open-world game, allowing players to craft their own unique experiences and adventures and forge deeper connections with its vast, mysterious world. Elden Ring's open-world design introduces a distinct tension between exploration and challenge. The sprawling, wide-open environments give players the freedom to explore at their own pace, often bypassing enemies entirely. This freedom is a double-edged sword. On one hand, it allows for a unique sense of discovery and adventure, but on the other, it can undermine the sense of danger and engagement that the Souls series is known for. When players can simply gallop past threats on torrent, the urgency and weight of these encounters are diminished. Consider this. In traditional Souls games, the path is often narrow and treacherous, every enemy encounter a test of skill and endurance. In Elden Ring, many of these overworld battles can be skipped with a well-timed dash or jump on torrent, reducing them to optional set pieces rather than integral parts of the game's challenge. This design choice raises questions about the purpose of these encounters. Should every encounter in a Souls-like game serve a purpose beyond simply filling the world with arbitrary activity? Or should they all be meaningful hurdles that contribute to the player's growth and the narrative's tension? Much has been made about the noticeable difficulty spike encountered in the last stages of Elden Ring. From the mountaintop of the giants, through crumbling Farum Azula, leading up to the final boss gauntlet. In these areas, the game's earlier promise, struggling with a particular area, well, go somewhere else, become stronger and return, starts to break down. The open-world freedom that once allowed for varied progression narrows into a more linear path, reducing side exploration and optional routes. Here, the balancing conundrum that has simmered throughout the game comes to a head. As players advance through these final areas, the game's difficulty is no longer mitigated by the option to explore other regions and come back stronger. When there are no more places left to visit, no more dungeons to conquer, or hidden secrets to uncover, players must confront the formidable challenges head-on. This shift in design can lead to frustration, particularly for those who thrived on the freedom of choice and exploration earlier in the game. The dreaded advice to just get good, often seen in online forums, becomes less a playful taunt and more an acknowledgement of this stark reality. The game's structure, which once celebrated player agency, now demands a higher level of mastery without the safety net of alternative paths for growth. Despite these challenges, there's no denying the brilliance of Elden Ring's map design. In an era where open-world games are often criticized for cluttered maps, overloaded with icons and markers, often likened to a Ubisoft formula of checklist-style exploration, Elden Ring opts for a more organic approach. The map is sparse, leaving much to the player's curiosity and intuition. Instead of overwhelming the player with waypoints, the map features subtle drawings and hints that naturally draw the eye towards points of interest. This design encourages genuine exploration, rewarding players for their curiosity and the attention to detail without pulling them out of the experience. This subtlety in design can be compared to the effective, yet unobtrusive systems seen in games like Breath of the Wild, where a radar gently guides players towards shrines, or Ghost of Tsushima, where the wind itself becomes a natural marker, guiding players without breaking immersion. Such tools serve to integrate the player's goals seamlessly into the world and the narrative, maintaining a delicate balance between guidance and freedom. Elden Ring captures this balance well, at least in terms of visual and navigational design. Here though, I hope that FromSoftware considers implementing a system akin to the radar found in Breath of the Wild, a system that guides players towards points of interest in a subtle, unobtrusive way without resorting to an abundance of on-screen markers. In Breath of the Wild, the radar gently nudges players in the right direction, allowing for organic discovery, while still giving a sense of purpose and direction. This approach could be invaluable in Elden Ring's sprawling landscapes, helping to maintain the delicate balance between exploration and progression. With such a system, players would be encouraged to explore more intentionally, finding hidden treasures, secret paths, and powerful upgrades relevant to their playthrough, without feeling lost or overwhelmed by the vastness of the world. This subtle guidance would reduce the temptation to rely on external guides or walkthroughs to find meaningful progression. Instead of breaking immersion by consulting a guide, players could remain engaged within the world itself, discovering secrets at their own pace. This would not only enhance the player's experience but also deepen their connection to the game's narrative and environment. A radar-like system could help ensure that every corner of the Lands Between feels like it holds potential for discovery, aligning perfectly with FromSoftware's philosophy of rewarding curiosity and exploration. At its core, such a system could preserve the challenge and depth Elden Ring is known for, while providing a gentle hand to guide those who seek it. It would offer a middle ground between complete freedom and structured exploration, enriching the game world without diminishing its mystery. By incorporating radar or similar tool, FromSoftware could maintain the thrill of discovery, while ensuring that every adventure, every detour, and every hidden path feels meaningful and rewarding for the player. Exploration in Elden Ring can often feel like a gamble. The world is vast, and while there are countless dungeons, caves, and hidden areas to explore, not all of them provide rewards that feel commensurate with the time and effort invested. The game occasionally falters in delivering weighted rewards for the time and challenge these areas present, leading to an inverse Pavlovian response. Players may learn, often quickly, that not every corner of the world is worth exploring, which deters further exploration, contrary to the game's open-world aspirations. This feeling of inconsistency can create a sense of aversion to exploration, where the excitement of uncovering something new is tempered by the disappointment of unrewarding encounters. Unlike earlier Souls games, where exploration is often tightly integrated with progression and storytelling, Elden Ring's open world sometimes lacks this focused intent. The result is a world where not every path feels meaningful, and players may find themselves questioning the value of their explorative efforts. To maximize the impact of its expansive world, Elden Ring could benefit from a more deliberate approach to environmental design and reward structures, by ensuring that each area, whether a dungeon or a hidden cave, offers both a challenge and a meaningful reward, be it through storytelling, unique items, or character progression. The game could maintain the player's sense of wonder and purpose throughout the entirety of its vast landscape. Jesse Schell, in his book The Art of Game Design, offers valuable insights into the delicate equilibrium between the details a game provides and the space it leaves for a player's imagination. He reminds us that a game isn't just a collection of visuals, mechanics, and rules. It's a framework that sparks a mental model in the player's mind, inviting them to fill in the gaps. One of the guiding principles Schell proposes is this: only detail what you can do well. Players possess incredibly vivid imaginations, often richer than what limited game budgets or technology can afford. If a game cannot deliver high-quality voice acting or immersive environments, it might be more effective to leave these aspects to the player's imagination. When a game taps into these fantasies, it provides a thin thread to reality, around which a vibrant world of imagination can crystallize. In Elden Ring, this balance between detail and imagination is vital. The game world, theoretically, with its sprawling landscapes and cryptic storytelling, should provide just enough detail to draw players in, while leaving ample room for them to imagine the rest. This balance should not only enhance the player's experience, but also deepen their connection to the game's world and its mysteries. The vast open fields and expansive environments are intended to evoke a sense of freedom and exploration, but in practice they often feel like wasted space. The game's design appears stretched, much like Bilbo's description of feeling like butter scraped over too much bread. The combat mechanics and player toolkit in Elden Ring closely resemble those of Dark Souls 3, but the vast open-world format dilutes what makes that gameplay loop so compelling. The Souls games are renowned for their deep, enigmatic worlds. Worlds where the story is not handed to the player, but discovered through exploration and observation. Explicit explanations are rare. Instead, once key elements are introduced through the cinematic intro sequences and early brief dialogues or encounters with characters like the crestfallen warrior, designed to nudge the player toward the overall objective, the narrative shifts. It moves away from direct storytelling and embraces something more subtle, the environmental storytelling we were talking about earlier. Video games as a medium blend elements from painting, literature, and cinema. Cutscenes, often borrowed from cinema, can offer dramatic moments and deepen the connection to the characters. But they also risk breaking immersion by pulling players out of the action. In contrast, environmental storytelling keeps the player engaged, allowing the story to emerge organically as they explore, fight, and survive. It keeps the pace intact, never interrupting the flow of gameplay, and it ensures that players remain active participants in the unfolding narrative. They are not just spectators, they are explorers, detectives, piecing together the history and lore of the world around them. This approach rewards curiosity and observation, making every discovery a personal achievement. It engages the imagination, asking players to decipher the game's codes and symbols on their own terms. This active participation in uncovering the story provides a deep sense of satisfaction and ownership. This delicate balance between structure and freedom, detail and ambiguity, is what makes the Souls games so powerful. They offer a world that feels alive, with a story that is as much about what is shown as what is left unsaid, inviting players to delve deeper and uncover the mysteries that lie beneath the surface. A critical aspect of this balance is the creation of believable, lived-in environments. In previous Souls games, every corner of the world felt intentional, brimming with history and meaning. Yharnam from Bloodborne is an excellent example. A relatively small play space that convincingly hints at a much larger world. The verticality of Yharnam, with its towering stacks of buildings and winding streets, suggests a densely populated city, even though players only explore a fraction of it. The cursed inhabitants seem to belong to this sprawling, oppressive environment, reinforcing the narrative and the player's sense of place within it. In contrast, Elden Ring often falls short in creating this sense of a believable world. The game's vast fields and scattered villages often feel empty, lacking the density and detail that would suggest a once thriving population. When a village consists of only a couple of buildings, it becomes challenging for players to imagine a whole community's life and culture. This lack of detail breaks immersion, at least for me, making it harder for me to engage with the world and its story. By far the most compelling part of Elden Ring are its legacy dungeons. Deliberately designed areas that often culminate in a unique and memorable boss encounter. These sections harken back to the more focused level design of earlier Souls games, where every path and shortcut feels thoughtfully placed, and every encounter adds to the overarching narrative. Here, the addition of a jump button allows for a more vertical exploration and divergent paths, enhancing the depth and complexity of these spaces. Stormveil Castle is a prime example of FromSoftware's exceptional level design when the developers confine themselves to more traditional, tightly structured dungeons reminiscent of those found in the Dark Souls series. This area encapsulates what makes FromSoftware's environment so engaging: the combination of intricate level architecture, environmental storytelling, and a high degree of player agency and exploration. At its core, Stormveil Castle exemplifies Elden Ring's ability to create spaces that are both vast and interconnected, blending the grandiose scale of a castle in ruin with the nuanced details of a fortress that has seen many battles. The castle itself feels alive, as though it has a history etched into every crumbling wall and barricaded door. The use of verticality and shortcuts, multiple paths and hidden side areas are not just design choices, they are narrative tools that tell the story of a once great fortress now fallen into disrepair. One of the standout features of Stormveil Castle is its verticality. Unlike many open-world games where exploration tends to be horizontal, Stormveil encourages players to think in the 3 dimensions. From the moment players step foot into the castle grounds, they are faced with the choice of multiple paths that wind upwards, downwards and sideways, each offering a unique perspective of the castle and its defences. This verticality serves several purposes. First, it enhances the scale of the castle. Climbing up a narrow tower or descending into a hidden basement gives players a sense of the castle's height and depth, making the environment feel larger and more imposing than it might otherwise. Players can stand on a high battlement and look down at areas they've already explored, or gaze upward at places they have yet to reach, constantly reminded of the castle's vastness and complexity. Second, verticality adds a layer of challenge and strategy to exploration. Navigating Stormveil is not just about moving forward, it is about understanding the layout of the castle, finding ways to ascend or descend safely, and uncovering the secrets hidden in its many nooks and crannies. The castle's numerous ladders, ledges, and narrow walkways require careful navigation, often under the threat of enemy archers or ambushers, or flame-spewing birds. This design keeps players on their toes, encouraging them to approach each new area with caution and curiosity. Stormveil Castle's layout also incorporates numerous shortcuts and interconnected paths, hallmarks of FromSoftware's best level design. These shortcuts serve both as a reward for exploration and as a means of making traversal more convenient. For example, after a difficult section full of traps and enemies, players might find a locked gate that, once opened from the other side, provides a quick route back to a site of grace. This creates a satisfying sense of progress and mastery over the environment. The multiple paths within Stormveil Castle give players a sense of agency, allowing them to choose how they want to approach the castle's defences. They might take a direct, more dangerous route through the main gate, facing a gauntlet of enemies head-on, barraged by arrows from above. Alternatively, they could choose a more circuitous route that takes them around the castle's perimeter, sneaking through side passages and avoiding detection. This non-linear approach encourages players to experiment and find the path that best suits their playstyle, making each playthrough of Stormveil potentially unique. Beyond the main pathways, Stormveil Castle is filled with optional side areas that add depth to the lore of Elden Ring's world. These side areas often contain hidden treasures, challenging mini-bosses, or unique environmental storytelling elements that flesh out the history of the castle and its inhabitants. Players might stumble upon the decaying, horrific face of an old god, or discover a hidden armory stocked with the weapons of fallen soldiers. Each of these side areas is carefully crafted to feel like a natural part of the castle's history, providing players with a deeper understanding of the world they are exploring. These areas are not only rewarding from a gameplay perspective, but also enrich their narrative. The story of Stormveil Castle and its role in the larger conflict of Elden Ring is pieced together through the environmental cues, item descriptions, and the placement of enemies. The castle's fortifications, broken barricades, and abandoned siege equipment tell the tale of a fortress that has withstood numerous assaults, adding a layer of authenticity and immersion to the player's experience. Stormveil Castle is bookended by two of the most interesting boss encounters in Elden Ring, Morgott the Fell Omen and Godric the Grafted. From a design perspective, both bosses serve as critical tests of the player's understanding of the game's mechanics and their ability to adapt to new challenges. Morgott acts as a gatekeeper to Stormveil, challenging players with a diverse set of attacks that requires precise timing and adaptability. This encounter introduces players to the level of difficulty they can expect from the game's major bosses, emphasizing the importance of learning enemy patterns and remaining patient. Morgott's presence reinforces the castle's defensive nature, serving as a guardian who tests the worthiness of any who would dare to enter. Godric the Grafted, on the other hand, is a showcase of Elden Ring's more grotesque and imaginative boss designs. As a ruler who has grafted the limbs of his enemies onto his own body, Godric represents the castle's twisted legacy and the corruption that has taken root within its walls. The fight against Godric is as much about spectacle as it is about skill, with its grotesque form and unpredictable attack patterns, creating a memorable and challenging encounter. A moment including a dragon is particularly harrowing. The design of Godric's arena, with its towering structures and limited space, adds to the intensity of the battle, forcing players to think strategically about positioning and movement. I think what elevates Stormveil Castle above similar areas in previous Souls games is the integration of improved exploration mechanics found throughout Elden Ring. The addition of a jump button adds a new dimension to the exploration, allowing players to reach areas that would have been inaccessible in earlier titles. This mechanic encourages players to think creatively about how they navigate the environment, rewarding those who take risks with hidden items, shortcuts, and alternate routes. Going back to the original Dark Souls for this series really emphasized how huge this change was. The design of Stormveil Castle also benefits from Elden Ring's open world structure, which, while I've criticized it for feeling overly expansive, provides a sense of scale and freedom that enhances the experience of exploring the castle's many layers. The ability to approach the castle from different directions and explore its surroundings before adventuring inside adds a layer of depth to the experience, making Stormveil feel like a real place within a larger living world. Ultimately, Stormveil Castle is a testament to FromSoftware's mastery of traditional level design within the context of a more open-world game. It demonstrates how tightly constructed environments, when paired with thoughtful exploration mechanics and compelling narrative elements, can create some of the most memorable and engaging experiences that you can find in Elden Ring. By leveraging verticality, multiple paths, shortcuts, and rich environmental storytelling, Stormveil Castle captures the essence of what makes the Souls series so beloved, proving that even within a vast open world, there is still immense value in the focused, deliberate design of a traditional dungeon. As the game progresses, the repetition of certain bosses and enemies in the open-world areas and the optional dungeons diminish their impact. This reuse of assets stands in stark contrast to previous Souls titles, where each encounter felt distinct and meaningful. Dark Souls 2's bonfire aesthetics and Sekiro's boss memory rematches allowed players to relive and overcome challenging encounters they enjoyed without diluting their significance in the narrative. In Elden Ring, without these tools, the repetition makes once memorable boss fights feel routine, weakening their overall experience. Ultimately, all this brings us to the core issue. Elden Ring's open-world format, while ambitious, often feels like a departure from what makes the Souls series so compelling. The game's legacy dungeons and meticulously crafted encounters demonstrate where FromSoftware's strengths lie, in creating tightly designed, immersive environments that reward exploration and mastery. The expansive stretches of open world, by contrast, feel like unnecessary padding, stretching the player's time and patience. Previous Souls games managed to convey a sense of vast, interconnected worlds without resorting to sprawling, empty fields. They focused on density, detail, and meaningful progression, ensuring that every step felt purposeful. As Elden Ring demonstrates, bigger isn't always better. It's the quality of the journey, not the sheer size of the world, that truly captures the player's imagination and keeps them coming back for more. Riding the road to the south of Castellensis, near the suppressing pillar, the player hears a cry. "The pain! The pain! My arms! My legs! Each lies a bloody ruin! Ah! The pain! The exquisite pain! Bayle! Vile Bayle! O terror incarnate! There is life in me yet. I will soon feast upon your heart. Mark my words. You too shall know fear." Aigon, the broken Drake warrior, is a ragged figure driven by a fierce desire for vengeance against his nemesis, Bayle the Dread. His body is frail and battered from years of relentless pursuit. Aigon's armor is a makeshift collection of tattered scraps scavenged from battlefields, each piece a testament to his desperate survival. His helm, oddly shaped like a bugle, is dented and worn, while filthy trinkets and grimy talismans dangle from his battered armor. Remnants of a past life and battles long lost. Despite his broken state, Aigon's resolve is unyielding. He crafts great arrows bristling with sharp gravel stones, each one forged in agony and designed to pierce dragonhide, symbols of his obsession with bringing down Bayle. His existence is consumed by this quest for vengeance. Every ragged breath and painful step a march towards his final confrontation. Further along the path you will encounter an ancient dragon man, the first indication this quest will explore the domain of dragons and drakes. Down through the dragon pit you descend, past shrines erected, presumably, in the ancient tradition of dragon communion. After all, the worship of the ancient dragons does not conflict with the belief in the Erd Tree. This seal and lightning itself are both imbued with gold. Long ago, Godwyn the Golden defeated the ancient dragon Fortisax and befriended his fallen foe, an ancient that gave rise to the ancient dragon cult in the capital. The presence of beastmen and the architecture of the dragon pit recall Farum Azula, the domain of the dragon lord Placidusax. The dragon lord whose seat lies at the heart of the storm beyond time is said to have been Elden Lord in the age before the Erd Tree. Once his god was fled, the lord continued to await its return. Beyond the dragon pits, the terrain becomes increasingly treacherous as you begin the ascent up Jagged Peak. The mountain earns its name well. Sharp, unforgiving rocks jut out at every angle, and the narrow paths wind precariously along steep cliffsides. The higher you climb, the more the skies darken, heavy clouds swirling overhead like a cauldron brewing a tempest. The plateau at the mountain's base is a battlefield marked by deep scars and scorched earth, a place where dragons frequently clash over territory. Today, two dragons face off, their roars echoing through the cliffs, each vying to claim the plateau as their own. They circle each other with lethal intent, wings beating the air in a thunderous rhythm. Without warning, they collide in a violent clash of teeth and claws, each strike sending tremors through the ground. The dragons are locked in a deadly dance, their bodies a blur of motion as they tear into each other with savage fury. Their roars shake the air, and the ground beneath them trembles with every blow. Just as one dragon gains the upper hand, pinning its rival to the earth, you charge into the fray on Torrent, determined to seize this opportunity. The dragons, now enraged by your intrusion, turn their attention to you, momentarily united against this new threat. With Torrent's agility and your skill, you weave between them, striking with precision at their vulnerable spots. A powerful strike to the neck of one dragon sends it crashing to the ground, stunned and weakened. The second dragon lunges, but you sidestep, driving your weapon into its exposed side. With a final burst of energy, you deliver a decisive blow to its skull, and it collapses beside its fallen rival. Both dragons lie defeated, the plateau now yours by right of conquest. Breathing heavily, you climb back onto Torrent, casting a glance at the vanquished beasts before turning your gaze upward to the mountain trail that awaits. On a side path, you may meet with a dragon priestess. The priestess was once an ancient dragon herself, but sacrificed that form for feeble flesh to aid in the destruction of Bayle the Dread.
Now seek the Jagged Peak. There you will find Bayle,
The oldest and vilest of all dragons.
land-bound warrior. Follow your desire and slay the foul beast. Devour its throbbing heart. I will grant you the strength required in the name of my lord Placidusax. In a long past time, Bayle turned upon the Dragon Lord. The foul traitor assailed our master and inflicted a grievous wound, only to make a hasty retreat, becoming a sworn enemy of the brood. Since that day, Bayle and his bloodline, the Drakes, have served as sacrifices for dragon communion. Land-bound warrior, my lord Placidusax has shown your kind what must be done. Seek communion. Sate your boundless appetite. Feel the euphoria of a dragon's essence taking root in your meager frame. Again on the road, you meet with Igon.
What a sight! A true warrior, if ever there was one. A fellow Drake warrior. Igon, piteous Igon. Do you not remember? Conjure your past, how once you were, when fear was yet foreign to ye. Ah, Drake warrior, dear friend, grant me this one wish. Take this finger, my finger, scale the jagged peak, face Bayle the Dread, and when you do, summon me. Summon my soul. My limbs are limbs no more. My heart is twice overfilled with fear. But a Drake warrior I remain, and my soul yet lies on the mountain. Proud Drake warrior, I beg of you, scale the jagged peak, face Bayle the Dread, and when you do, summon me. Summon my soul.
Ahead, a great spirit spring looms, its ethereal mist curling up from the earth like a beacon calling you skyward. These towering columns of air, glowing faintly with spectral light, are the lifeblood of the mountain's ascent. You nudge Torrent forward, feeling the creature's anticipation beneath you, his muscles bunching in readiness. Together, you approach the base of the spirit spring, the air around it shimmering with arcane energy. With a swift motion, Torrent leaps into the spring. For a breathless moment, the world seems to hang in suspension as the force of the spring catches you, lifting both mount and rider into the air. The sensation is exhilarating. A sudden, powerful surge of upward momentum, as if the mountain itself has decided to carry you closer to the heavens. The ground falls away rapidly beneath you. The jagged rocks of narrow paths reduce to a blur of grey. Time slows as you soar higher, the cold air rushing past, tugging at your clothes and hair. Torrent's hooves paw at the empty space, his form buoyed by the supernatural force, as if he is as much a part of the wind as the mountain itself. The sensation is one of freedom, a break from the harsh reality of the climb, a fleeting moment where gravity loses its hold and the burdens of the quest slip away, leaving only the pure joy of flight. As you reach the apex of the Spirit Springs arc, the momentum eases, and gravity gently reclaims its dominion. You and Torrent descend back to the earth, landing with a thud that sends a jolt through your spine, but Torrent absorbs the impact with practiced ease. The terrain has changed once more, a higher ledge closer to the mountain's peak, but still far from your final destination. The storm clouds above crackle ominously, a reminder of the trials yet to come. With a shared breath, you urge Torrent forward again, the two of you an unyielding force against the mountain's challenge. Another spirit spring awaits in the distance, its misty tendrils beckoning. The path is treacherous, but with Torrent beneath you, the climb feels like a dance between earth and sky, a blend of strength and grace that only you and your steadfast companion can achieve. As you ascend the jagged peak, Torrent carrying you through the final spirit spring, the air grows heavier with tension. The peak looms above, shrouded in storm clouds, but one last obstacle stands in your way before your fateful encounter with Bayle the Dread. Cenisax, one of the last of the ancient dragons. The sight of the colossal beast is both awe-inspiring and terrifying. Cenisax's hardened grey scales shimmer in the stormlight, and 4 great golden wings spread wide, casting a shadow over the plateau. Red lightning arcs from the dragon's form, crackling through the air like a living force of destruction, a signature weapon of the ancient dragons themselves. According to Lanedel's secret dragon cult incantations, red lightning is a weapon spoken of only in legend, wielded by the mightiest of dragons, the ancient beings who once called crumbling Farum Azula their home, with Dragon Lord Placidusax as their master. But Cenisax is far from home now, perched upon this mountain, standing guard as if it were his sworn duty to prevent you from reaching Bayle. Perhaps he seeks to avenge his fallen lord, as Florisax had tried to do, striking down the traitor Bayle in Placidusax's name. Or perhaps his purpose is more selfish. A dragon who once betrayed his master to follow Bayle's tyrannical reign, now tasked with protecting his new leader's domain. The reason matters little. Cenisax is your final barrier, and the clash that ensues is nothing short of harrowing. The ancient dragon is unlike the lesser drakes you've faced up to now, its sheer power shaking the earth beneath you. With every beat of its great golden wings, Cenisax unleashes torrents of red lightning that arc in every direction, lighting up the sky and cascading down onto the battlefield. The shallow lake upon which the battle takes place only amplifies the danger. The water conducts the lightning, sending deadly shocks through the entire arena and forcing you to stay constantly on the move. Cenisax wields his power with terrifying precision. At times, the dragon forges a blade of pure red lightning, swinging it with lethal force, each stroke of the ethereal weapon capable of cutting through your defenses with ease. Its claws are equally terrifying, ripping through the earth and sending shockwaves that could tear you apart in an instant. You must rely on all your skill, dodging the dragon's sweeping attacks and finding moments to strike amidst the chaos of lightning and claw and fang. The fight is long and grueling, every movement fraught with peril, but with great perseverance you finally manage to bring the mighty dragon to its knees. With a final roar, Cenisax collapses, its golden wings crumbling, the red lightning flickering and dying away. As the storm begins to calm, the peak now stands within reach. The path to Bayle the Dread lies open, but the cost of this final ascent has been high. You steel yourself for the final climb, knowing that the true battle is yet to come. As you near the peak, the weather turns hostile. An unnatural lightning storm brews above, forks of blinding light lashing out with unpredictable fury. The air crackles with electricity, each step charged with potential peril as thunderclaps echo like war drums in the sky. The storm seems almost sentient, aiming its wrath directly at you, forcing swift reflexes and shelter beneath overhangs as bolts strike dangerously close, sending showers of sparks and debris in all directions. Finally, battered and weary, you reach the summit. a vast open plateau, encircled by colossal stone pillars that arc towards the stormy sky, forming a grim colosseum. The ground is scorched black and the air is thick with the smell of ozone and ash. At the center stands Bayle the Dread, an awe-inspiring behemoth of a dragon. Bayle the Dread, the ancient forefather of the Drakes, is a colossal and fearsome beast, a living testament to the countless battles and betrayals. His massive body is covered in jagged scars and wounds, the indelible marks of a lifetime of violence. His dark scales, once likely as majestic as his former master, the Dragon Lord Placidusax, are now marred with deep gashes and fresh burns, the telltale sign of an endless war against time, dragons, and his own past. Despite his battered form, Bayle exudes a raw, terrifying power that cannot be denied. One of his legs is missing, torn off in a brutal battle, likely with the Dragon Lord himself. His wings, once mighty and fearsome, now hang in tatters. One wing is so ravaged that the bone juts out through ragged tears in the leathery membrane. These injuries have done little to diminish his presence. His head is crowned with a pair of massive, curved horns that sweep back in a deadly arc, framing a face full of rage and malevolence. His eyes burn with a fiery hatred, and his mouth is filled with rows upon rows of razor-sharp teeth that glisten with malice. If one dares to look closely, the true horror of Bayle is revealed. Embedded in his thick, scarred neck are two severed heads of the Dragon Lord Placidusax, their jaws still clamped down in a final desperate act of vengeance. These grisly trophies gnash eternally, as if attempting to reclaim their lost honor even in death, a haunting reminder of the grievous battle that nearly ended them both. Bayle carries these heads not just as a mark of his betrayal, but as a twisted badge of his triumph over his former master. Bayle's presence alone causes the very mountain he inhabits to quake, his roars sending tremors down its jagged peak and stirring its molten core to life. This dread dragon is more than just a beast. He is a harbinger of destruction, a force of nature whose mere existence causes chaos to boil and churn. Even in his scarred, broken state, Bayle remains a fearsome threat, a testament to his terrifying power and unyielding will. Remembering your vow, you unfurl Aegon's granted finger, summoning the broken Drake warrior for one last time.
Curse you, Bayle! I hereby vow you will rue this day. Behold, a true Drake warrior, and I, Aegon, your fears made flesh. Solid of scale you might be, foul dragon, but I will riddle with holes your rotten hide, with a hail of harpoons, with every last drop of my being.
Aegon in this moment echoes the words of his inspiration, Captain Ahab.
Towards thee I roll, thou all-destroying, but unconquering whale. To the last I grapple with thee. From hell's heart I stab at thee. For hate's sake I spit my last breath at thee.
Bayle responds with a deafening roar that shakes the very foundations of the peak. Lightning striking the pillars around you in a symphony of destruction. The final battle commences, a dance of might and strategy amidst a theatre of storms. The clash is epic and tumultuous. Bayle unleashes torrents of flame and lightning, his massive tail sweeping across the battlefield with devastating force. The storm mirrors his rage, each of his attacks amplified by the elemental chaos surrounding you. Together you and Aegon weave between assaults, coordinating strikes that exploit fleeting moments of vulnerability. The battle with Bayle the Dread reaches a fever pitch as the great dragon, sensing his impending defeat, draws upon the primal power of the mountain and the raging storm above. His roar reverberates through the air, shaking the very stones beneath your feet. As he channels his raw energy, Wings made of pure lightning burst forth from his back, crackling with red and white energy, casting an eerie glow across the storm-racked Colosseum. With a mighty leap, Bayle takes to the skies, a colossal shadow against the swirling storm clouds. High above, he hovers like a god of wrath, raining down bolts of red lightning that scorch the earth and send shockwaves rippling across the arena floor. You dodge and weave, narrowly escaping the deadly strikes as flames lick at your heels and thunder roars in your ear. The air crackles with electricity, and the smell of ozone is overpowering now. The Colosseum, already battered and broken, is wreathed in flames, and the storms that rage around you threaten to consume everything in a cataclysm of fire and lightning. But the strain of his power is too much even for Bayle now. With a guttural cry, he plummets back to earth, landing with a thunderous crash that sends up a cloud of dust and debris. His wings of energy flicker and fade, the great beast now grounded but still defiant. Bayle unleashes torrents of flame and lightning still, his massive jaws snapping as he lunges forward, desperate to consume you in his fury. Each attack is more frenzied than the last, his massive form heaving with exertion as his broken body refuses to give in. With a final surge of strength, you press the attack. Striking at Bayle's exposed flanks and wounded limbs, the dragon staggers, his once mighty form now a ruin of scales and exposed bone. With one last desperate roar, Bayle raises his shattered wing to the heavens, summoning a great bolt of lightning that strikes the exposed bone with a blinding flash. The energy surges through him, and he collapses with a ground-shaking thud. His body stills, and he takes one final rattling breath before falling silent. The flames around you die, and the storm begins to calm. You have conquered the dread. Aegon roars one last time.
Hail the dread! You shall haunt me no longer.
His spirit fades. The jagged peak falls silent. It is perhaps fitting that Elden Ring's DLC, Shadow of the Erdtree, includes a nod to Herman Melville's Moby Dick. A story about a man driven to madness in his relentless pursuit of a foe, defying nature itself. This homage perfectly captures the dark allure and philosophical depth that have always defined the Souls games, and Elden Ring in particular. The game's narrative and art direction excel in creating moments that linger in the player's mind long after the screen has gone dark, conjuring a world rich with atmosphere and existential dread. Yet this quest also encapsulates the fundamental issues that pervade Elden Ring's DLC, most notably the disconnect between the narrative ambition and the gameplay experience. The journey up the Jagged Peak to face Bayle the Dread is a prime example of this dissonance. Narratively, it's a climb filled with tension and foreboding, promising an epic confrontation that draws inspiration from Melville's tale of obsession and revenge. However, from a gameplay perspective, the ascent itself is disappointingly simplistic and lacks the depth of challenge that the narrative sets up. The climb to the peak is largely devoid of the tactile resistance and environmental hazards that would make it feel like a genuine struggle against nature. Instead of being an arduous journey that tests the player's skills and perseverance, it feels more like a linear path that fails to engage beyond its visual presentation. The overuse of spirit springs that aid in skipping large tracts of the mountain demonstrates this most obviously. The over-reliance on recycled dragon boss types as you climb the mountain is another area where the DLC falls short in microcosm. While Bayle the Dread is narratively compelling and visually impressive, the mechanics of the lesser dragon fights leading up to Bayle are not markedly different from the dragon encounters players have already faced throughout the main game. This reuse of familiar boss patterns and enemy types undermines the sense of novelty and challenge that one would expect from a climactic DLC battle. The encounters lack the unique mechanical depth that could have transformed them into a memorable and exhilarating part of the climb up the mountain, rather than as retreads of past encounters. Ultimately, Shadow of the Erdtree demonstrates a pattern seen throughout Elden Ring, a game that excels in creating a hauntingly beautiful world and complex lore, but often falters in delivering equally innovative and engaging gameplay mechanics. The narrative and artistic elements remain the peak of the experience, capturing the imagination and evoking a sense of wonder and dread. Yet the gameplay, at times, feels like it offers much to be desired, lacking the fresh and challenging design that could have made the entire experience truly unforgettable. While Elden Ring offers an expansive world filled with secrets and hidden treasures, the rewards for exploration often fall short of meaningful engagement. The game presents itself as a vast playground for discovery, yet the tangible benefits of exploration rarely align with the effort required to uncover them. This misalignment between effort and reward raises questions about the effectiveness of its open-world design and the value it places on player time and investment. In Elden Ring, exploration is often accompanied by a reward, but these rewards frequently fail to provide a meaningful impact on the player's journey. The issue lies not necessarily in the scarcity of rewards, but in their relevance to the player's chosen path. For instance, if a player has chosen a dexterity build, discovering a powerful strength-based weapon becomes an irrelevant outcome. Similarly, finding a spell or incantation that cannot be used due to a lack of investment in the necessary attributes renders the discovery unimportant. The problem isn't just one of item placement, it's about how the game values the player's time and effort. Consider the challenge of reaching and defeating Millennia, an endgame boss hidden within an already hidden area. The reward for overcoming this arduous task is her Great Rune, which offers a temporary benefit similar to mechanics seen in Bloodborne. However, to activate this ability, the player must consume a rare item, and the effect is loss upon death. The utility of this reward is limited to the remainder of the current playthrough, a span of time that is typically brief once Millennia has been defeated. The inability to carry Great Runes into New Game Plus further diminishes the value of such hard-earned rewards, leaving players with a sense of wasted effort rather than accomplishment. Elden Ring also suffers from instances where potentially game-changing items are hidden away without any clear indication of their existence. This approach creates a scenario where the game punishes players arbitrarily, rather than rewarding thoughtful exploration. For example, an item that significantly reduces the difficulty of Malekith's second phase exists, but without prior knowledge or sheer luck, most players will never find it in time to effectively use it. Similarly, some enemies, like the Deathrite birds, are significantly easier to defeat with holy damage, but only if the player has the right equipment or spells at hand. This system often feels more punitive than rewarding, especially when compared to the more directed design of previous Souls games. In Dark Souls, exploration rewarded players with items that were generally useful across different builds, or with knowledge that could change their approach to a challenge. In contrast, Elden Ring's sprawling world and vast inventory of rewards often feel like a scattershot approach, where the most valuable items can easily be missed or rendered irrelevant by the time they are found. The concept of addition by subtraction suggests that a more focused and concise player experience can be more rewarding than one bloated with content. By reducing the sheer number of items, locations, and narrative threads, Elden Ring could create a more impactful and memorable experience. Instead of overwhelming players with a vast number of mostly redundant rewards, a more curated set of meaningful items could ensure that every discovery feels valuable. Dark Souls offered a simpler narrative, with fewer characters and plot threads, making it easier for players to become emotionally invested and to track their progress through the world. Elden Ring's ambitious scope, with its numerous factions, characters, and storylines, often lead to a sense of narrative fragmentation. Important details and plot points risk being lost amid the noise, diluting the player's sense of purpose and connection to the world. A more streamlined approach, similar to Sekiro's focused storytelling, could help maintain player engagement and emotional investment. I think a useful comparison can be drawn between Elden Ring and the Assassin's Creed series, particularly when comparing something like Origins to Valhalla. While both games share similar mechanics and story structures, Valhalla's larger scale often leads to a bloated experience, with repetitive tasks and a diluted narrative focus. Players frequently note that while Valhalla offers more content, Origins provides a more engaging and tightly paced experience. This comparison highlights a key issue with Elden Ring's approach. More content does not necessarily equate to a better experience. The sheer size and scope of Elden Ring's world can sometimes feel more like a diluted Dark Souls than an evolution of its formula, offering a bigger, but not necessarily more exciting or rewarding world to explore. In this section, I want to dive into the concept of artificial difficulty. I know that there are many different definitions for this term, so I just wanted to be clear from the outset. In this video, I'm referring to the type of challenge in a game that comes not from the complexity or technical demands of an enemy's behavior or a moveset, or a specific puzzle or environmental encounter, but rather from the underlying numbers that govern an outcome. Specifically, the balance of damage output and damage received. In the early stages of the game, players encounter a finely tuned balance where skillful players are rewarded and mistakes are punished, but not excessively so. As the game progresses, particularly in the second half of the main story and its DLC, this balance begins to shift. The abundance of one-shot or one-combo kills becomes a frequent occurrence, leaving players with little room for error. The need to invest heavily in vigor, often to 40 or 50 points or more, just to avoid being one-shotted is a stark indicator of this shift. Instead of creating enemies that challenge a player's skills and mastery of the game mechanics, the difficulty relies heavily on inflated damage numbers. This trend, seen increasingly as FromSoftware releases games, feels, to me, like a poor crutch for difficulty, rather than well-designed challenges. So, what does this mean for players? Well, when difficulty is artificially inflated through damage numbers rather than any gameplay complexity, it changes the experience. It can shift the focus from learning and adapting to simply grinding and tanking hits, diluting the satisfaction of overcoming obstacles. True difficulty should, in my view, come from a nuanced design, where every enemy feels like a new puzzle to solve, a test of both strategy and reflexes. It's the difference between a challenge that feels rewarding to overcome and one that feels arbitrary or unfair. As players delve deeper into the world of Elden Ring, they'll soon discover that not all builds are created equal. The choice of weapons, spells, and skills can dramatically alter the game's difficulty, making some fights feel impossible and others trivial. This brings us to an important aspect of artificial difficulty, the prevalence of certain builds and damage types. In Elden Ring, certain builds like those relying on bleed effects or staggering for critical hits have become incredibly popular. The reason is pretty simple. These builds exploit the game's mechanics to deal percentage-based damage or to repeatedly stun enemies, offsetting the otherwise daunting health pools of bosses. This can create a melt or be melted mentality, where the players either shred through bosses with optimized strategies, or get obliterated by them. Magic playthroughs in Elden Ring offer a range of options. If a boss is immune to glintstone sorcery, players can switch to fire or gravity magic. This variety adds a meaningful challenge, asking players to think strategically about which tools within their skill set can overcome specific obstacles. Melee combat, on the other hand, rarely offers the same flexibility. Consumables like throwing knives and rune arcs are designed to complement melee characters, adding depth to combat. But their limited availability and the need for farming contradict the game's try-retry loop. Players are forced to decide, do I use these precious items now and risk running out, or do I grind to gather more? This scarcity feels like artificial padding, creating unnecessary constraints where they aren't needed. Why not implement a system where consumables, once unlocked, replenish just like your Crimson Tier flasks? This way, you can't spam them indefinitely, but are encouraged to incorporate them more fully into your combat strategy. A similar system was introduced in 2023's Lords of the Fallen. It encourages players to experiment with their entire toolkit, without the dread of grinding for materials to restock. This quality of life change could greatly benefit Elden Ring and future FromSoftware titles. I hope FromSoft considers these ideas in future games, allowing for a more fluid and less frustrating experience where players can fully explore their options without unnecessary limitations. The other challenge with having so much, and another area that, surprisingly, Lords of the Fallen offered a much better experience at, is the control scheme then starts to hold you back. The process of applying buffs requires so much toggling of small icons while under pressure, cycling between multiple spells, consumables, and maybe even weapons requires so much of the D-pad on a controller. A smaller frustration is that while the player is knocked down, this cycling doesn't seem to register, creating a frustrating and unnecessary disconnect between player and character. This reliance on a few select builds undermines the intended approach of fair challenge. Instead of encouraging diverse strategies and creative play, the game funnels players towards specific choices, ironically creating a more one-dimensional experience where there are clear right and wrong ways to play. To address this, there are two potential solutions I can see. Scale everything back and return to the fundamentals of balanced, skill-based gameplay, or make the system more flexible, more immediately, allowing players to customize and adapt their build in a way that makes every encounter a specific puzzle any player can overcome, much like assembling a team in a Pokemon game. But there's another layer to this discussion. The experience can vary greatly depending on the player's knowledge. A newcomer playing Elden Ring without prior knowledge of these powerful builds may never stumble upon them naturally. They experience the game as the developers originally intended, unaware of the so-called broken mechanics. This disparity is part of what makes difficulty in Elden Ring so subjective. Player skill, knowledge of the game mechanics, and access to specific equipment or builds all contribute to wildly different experiences. The challenge for developers is to create a system where players feel equally rewarded, regardless of their approach or background knowledge. Ultimately, it's about finding the right balance, a game that rewards discovery and creativity while maintaining a fair and engaging challenge. Whether through scaling back to basics or opening up new possibilities, the goal remains the same: to craft an experience that is both challenging and fulfilling for all players. One path to alleviate some of the inherent frustration: every time you level up, your health and stamina are automatically upped by a specific amount, and remove the option to manually up health and stamina through the vigor and endurance stats. It will help give the game a better idea of how to balance enemy damage, as all players will roughly have similar health. In a game as expansive as Elden Ring, exploration is meant to be a core part of the experience. The world is obviously rich with hidden secrets, powerful items, and mysterious lore waiting to be uncovered. However, a tension arises between the joy of discovery and the need for build optimization, a tension that pulls the player in two very different directions. To truly optimize a build and reach the power level necessary to overcome the game's toughest challenges, players will often find themselves looking up online guides, hunting for specific items that are scattered across the map. This necessity can kill the spirit of natural exploration. Instead of wandering freely and discovering the world at their own pace, players are incentivized to follow a checklist, turning the rich tapestry of Elden Ring into a series of objective markers, no different from that of a Ubisoft title. In such a wide-scope environment, this need for optimization and the freedom of exploration aren't mutually compatible. The game's vastness and the disparity in item placement makes organic discovery less rewarding, especially when most rewards seem meaningless compared to the few essential items needed to make reasonable progress. More so than in any previous Souls game, Elden Ring emphasizes having the right tool for the job over developing your mechanical skills throughout the journey. The game shifts from a focus on player skill development to an almost exclusive focus on having the right gear. In many cases, this means the player isn't learning and adapting to enemies in the traditional sense, but is instead relying on the numbers, damage, defense, and status effects to see them through. In Elden Ring, there's often little to learn about the bosses themselves. Unlike previous games in the series where mechanical weaknesses and exploitable patterns offered insightful players a clear advantage, Elden Ring rarely provides such opportunities. Instead, the player faces the same type of challenge repeatedly, with each boss merely having a larger health pool or dealing more damage than the last. Over time, this repetition diminishes the sense of accomplishment that comes from overcoming challenges. The player isn't developing their skills as much as they are developing their inventory. So few of the necessary skills and abilities are part of the base player equipment. They must be found, acquired, and optimized, often outside the natural flow of gameplay. This imbalance between skill and optimization challenges the very essence of what makes the game rewarding in the first place. When the focus shifts too heavily towards itemization and having the right build, the nuanced, skill-based gameplay that the Souls series is known for takes a back seat. The question becomes, is the game challenging the player's abilities, or merely their ability to optimize? In Elden Ring, we have not intentionally tried to lower the game's difficulty, but I think more players will finish it this time. As I mentioned, the player's level of freedom to progress through the world or return to a challenge later are all elements that I feel will help people get through the game at a more leisurely pace. Also, there isn't a focus on pure action. The player has more agency to dictate their approach against, for example, the field bosses in the overworld, and how they utilize stealth in various situations. We've even reduced the number of hoops that you have to jump through to enjoy it in multiplayer, so we hope the players embrace the idea of receiving help from others. And we feel like the overall clear rate will go up this time because of these things. In Elden Ring, the tools available to the player are vast and varied. Weapons, spells, and special abilities offer countless ways to approach the game's challenges. Not all weapons are created equal, however. By leaning into these most powerful tools that the game provides but doesn't fully account for, players can too easily tip the scales in their favour. With the right combination of gear and strategy, even an unskilled player can tear through the hardest of bosses, reducing what should be epic encounters to mere trivialities. It's almost as if they have access to the source code itself, able to simply press delete on a particular boss. No thank you, goodbye Radahn. More so than any of the previous Souls games, Elden Ring makes difficulty an optional experience. The challenge is no longer a fixed element but a choice that the player makes, whether or not to abuse certain strategies and equipment. This raises an interesting question. If difficulty is so malleable, why not simply introduce options that allow players to adjust it more deliberately? Imagine if Elden Ring offered difficulty options that could tone down these damage numbers or enemy health pools. It could allow more people to experience the truly wonderful parts of these games, the intricate world design, the breathtaking art direction, without feeling forced into specific playstyles or relying on overpowered builds. The director Hidetaka Miyazaki has stated that he wanted to avoid forcing players into specific playstyles, but the current balance of Elden Ring often does the opposite. By making certain builds overwhelmingly effective, it nudges players towards optimization over exploration, limiting how they engage with the game. Adding difficulty options that adjust the game's core mechanics could democratize the experience, making it accessible to a broader audience without compromising the vision or integrity of the game. After all, isn't the essence of these games to provide a journey that is both challenging and deeply personal, shaped by each player's unique approach and choices? As we look to the future of these games, the developers obviously face a choice. Continue to build experiences that reward a narrow band of optimal play, or embrace a more inclusive philosophy that allows all players to find their own path to victory. To tie up this section, try and take a look at it this way. In Elden Ring, players are presented with what seems like endless choices. Hundreds of weapons and spells promising different ways to tackle the game's challenges, but this abundance is deceiving. Many of these options are misleading. Status effects like Deathblight, Sleep, and Madness rarely work on enemies, making them practically useless, and most spells of long casting times lack protection or deal little damage, narrowing viable choices to just a few. What this creates is an illusion of choice. Hundreds of options, yes, but only a few that are actually effective, especially in the late game. It's like searching for a needle in a haystack. Finding the right tool for the job is more about luck than strategy. In his book, The Art of Game Design, Jesse Schell writes about this concept. You might offer a soldier 10 guns, all different, but if one of them is clearly better than the rest, again it is like having no choice at all. When choices are offered to a player, but one of them is clearly better than the rest, this is called a dominant strategy. Once a dominant strategy is discovered, the game is no longer fun, because the puzzle of the game has been solved. There are no more choices to make. When you discover that a game you are working on has a dominant strategy, you should change the rules and balance things so that this strategy no longer dominates, and meaningful choice can be restored to the game. Miyazaki's addressed this in an interview with the PlayStation blog. In general, I'd like new players to feel unpressured and that they can approach the game at their pace. I don't want to enforce any playstyle or particular route because I'd like them to experience that sense of freedom. And I realize that while we offer games with a high level of challenge, we design them in a way that feels fulfilling to overcome. But I don't want new players to worry or stress about that difficulty too much. In Elden Ring, in my view, that balance is missing. Let's imagine a dedicated balance testing team working on a game like Elden Ring for 6 months. 8 testers, full-time, focused solely on game balance. Now that's a huge commitment. Thousands of hours of meticulous testing under ideal conditions. Assume no new features added, no boss mechanics changed, just a feature-locked period aiming for perfect balance. Now obviously that's unrealistic, but within just 2 hours of launch, the first 5,000 players will already have accumulated 10,000 hours of playtime, surpassing the total time spent by the balance team instantly. Within weeks, the collective player hours are orders of magnitude greater. The reality is, no matter how thorough the testing, the sheer volume of player engagement far outstrips any internal team's capabilities. This is why no game can be perfectly balanced at launch. With so many variables, character builds, weapons, spells, strategies, the potential combinations are nearly infinite. As players discover overpowered setups, it raises the difficulty threshold, locking out less effective options. The sandbox grows too wide and balance becomes elusive. Breaking the game and feeling invincible can sure be fun. But at a certain point, it undermines the experience the game is designed to try and provide. In a game like Elden Ring, where challenge and player growth are integral to its identity, this issue becomes even more pronounced. Overpowered builds and unbalanced gameplay strips away the sense of accomplishment that defines the Souls-like experience. So, developers face a tough decision. Rein in the sandbox to provide a more curated experience, or risk losing balance and challenge in a sea of endless player options. For Elden Ring and games like it, finding this balance is crucial to maintaining the essence of what makes these experiences so compelling. In the end, every choice in game design impacts player experience, and achieving balance is an impossible journey, one that continues long after the game launches and inevitably ends before it reaches its real conclusion, when financial pressures ensures it's no longer cost-effective and the team must move on. The ways in which Elden Ring attempts to level the playing field, regardless of player build, is primarily through the use of spirit ashes. Summonable creatures that can accompany us into most boss battles, and many of the most challenging open-world combat encounters. Nowhere is it more clear to see that these are an integral part of Elden Ring's design philosophy than in the Shadow of the Erdtree. The implementation of the 2 primary upgrade materials, the Shadow Tree fragments that boost the player's stats, and the revered spirit ashes that boost your spirit summons stats. The spirit ashes are clearly considered central enough that they make up one of the only 2 ways the player can noticeably increase damage scaling and remain level with the DLC's offerings. Choosing not to use spirit summons isn't just a matter of personal preference, it's an intentional handicap. Without them, some of the game's toughest fights can feel nearly impossible. Spirit summons have become a central part of the combat loop in Elden Ring, reflecting the vision of director Hidetaka Miyazaki, who has spoken about wanting to create a challenging experience while also making the game more accessible to a broader audience. Miyazaki's vision was to offer more tools and options for players to engage with, giving them new ways to approach challenges. But does this approach work as intended? The Spirit Summon system has 2 major flaws. Firstly, it's inherently passive. Once summoned, the player has little control over what happens next. The summons act on their own, drawing attention away from the player, but also removing a layer of engagement. You're less involved in the moment-to-moment decisions of combat. But perhaps more importantly, Spirit Summons have revealed, or even created, deeper flaws in Elden Ring's core design philosophy. Many bosses seem designed around the expectation that players will be using Spirit Summons, leading to large area effect attacks, hyper-aggressive behavior, and unpredictable target switching. These elements in combination create a more random, less skill-based challenge where success sometimes feels more like luck than mastery. The Spirit system is a natural evolution of the summoning system present in earlier Souls games, but here it leads to a cascading spiral of balance issues. On one hand, without the typical downsides of summoning, like increased boss health or the risk of invasions in online play, Spirit Summons can trivialize even the most challenging encounters. Take Millennia for example, a notoriously difficult boss. yet with the right spirit summon she can be defeated without ever truly engaging in her patterns. This undermines the fundamental essence of Souls games, where learning and mastering a fight through repeated attempts creates a profound sense of accomplishment. Instead, spirit summons can turn this experience into something akin to a skip button. Because spirit summons are such a powerful addition to the player's arsenal, the game is forced to compensate. Bosses must be faster, hit harder, and use more complex patterns to provide any challenge. This arms race between player strength and boss difficulty warps the game's balance, sometimes at the expense of fair skill-based gameplay. I want to be clear, I use spirit summons all the time in Elden Ring. You've likely seen them in action throughout this video. I didn't use summons in the previous Souls games, not because I'm particularly skilled. I'm far from a Soul level 1 naked run type of player, but because the design didn't push me towards them as it does here. I'm certainly not judging anybody who uses them. They're a legitimate tool designed intentionally by the developers, and in a single-player game there's no wrong way to play. If you see the end credits, you've won, just like anybody else. But spirit summons feel less like an easy mode and more like a skip mode, an option that lets you bypass the core challenges the game is meant to provide. Having what amounts to an I win button creates a dilemma. Either you intentionally handicap yourself by not using summons, always aware that an easy option is just a button press away, or you accept that the game won't truly challenge you. In this context, actual difficulty settings could provide a more balanced experience, encouraging players to engage fully with the game without relying on crutches. Summons in previous games, which were often other players, better fulfilled the original intent in my view. There was something special about teaming up with a stranger to conquer a difficult boss, creating a shared moment of triumph, though you'll never speak to each other, or by summoning the likes of Solaire or Henri, driving the narratives of the characters in the world. In contrast, silent spirit summons in Elden Ring often reduce these encounters to mere formalities. Personally, I believe spirit summons pose a significant challenge to maintaining a meaningful balance in Elden Ring. Would the game be better without them as it sounds today? Absolutely not. Many bosses would be nightmares without their help. But their existence has fundamentally altered boss design, often making these encounters less about skill and more about managing an overpowered ally. Maybe I'm reading too much into this, but the behavior of almost every boss in the Shadow of the Erdtree, the immediate rushdowns as soon as you enter the room happen in almost every fight in the DLC, seem to be a recognition that these summons upset the balance of the fights. These bosses seem intent on trying to stop you summoning at all costs. If we really wanted the whole world to play the game, we could just crank the difficulty down more and more, but that wasn't the right approach. Had we taken that approach, I don't think the game would have done what it did, because the sense of achievement that players gain from overcoming these hurdles is such a fundamental part of the experience. Turning down difficulty would strip the game of that joy, which, in my eyes, would break the game itself. Miyazaki had this to say about difficulty, and despite what you may be thinking on the back of the last few sections, I am wholly in agreement with this sentiment. The problem is, here, in Elden Ring, players are simultaneously too powerful to experience meaningful challenge if they utilize the full suite of options that the game itself grants, or woefully underpowered if they haven't found a particular item that trivializes the encounter, don't have the extensive game knowledge to understand what of the thousands of combinations of items breaks the game, don't enjoy the ways in which the game can be broken, or if they simply refuse to engage in everything the game potentially offers out of some sense of self-imposed challenge. In this game, the variety on offer is not net positive to the experience, and conversely, the lack of challenge variety severely damages the experience of the game. To an extent, cheese builds have existed in each Souls game, and it would of course be disingenuous to isolate this critique to Elden Ring alone. But the baseline combat challenge in those previous titles rarely necessitated resorting to these edge cases. Bosses like Gael, Medir, Artorias, and the like offered plenty of challenges, but were fairly balanced within the respective games' frameworks. Each progressive title represents an opportunity to learn to balance these boss encounters, but the lessons being learned here are, for me at least, the wrong ones, making it so that each boss becomes faster, requiring ever tighter reflex reactions, or worse, cheese to circumvent the difficulty in the first place, pushes the games further away from their DNA, and the stated intention of the developers. In the world of Elden Ring, players face a daunting challenge, reacting swiftly and accurately to a barrage of intense, high-speed attacks. But how feasible is it for the average player to keep up with such demands? To understand this, we need to delve into the science of reaction times. Psychological studies on reaction times have established some key benchmarks. In the simplest form of a choice-response task, where a participant must quickly respond to one of two stimuli, people typically respond within 350 to 450 milliseconds. The fastest responses under ideal conditions might even reach around 250 milliseconds. However, these experiments are controlled and straightforward. Compare this with the chaotic boss battles in Elden Ring. For example, the later bosses like Consort Radahn are designed with intense visual and auditory effects that significantly overwhelm players. The sheer volume and speed of these attacks can push reaction times to their limits, making it extraordinarily difficult to respond in time. Research indicates that several factors influence our response speed. These include age, intelligence, physical condition, and even the level of hunger or fatigue. Additionally, there's the speed-accuracy trade-off, where striving for accuracy often slows down response times. When a game demands increasingly precise reactions, the average player is going to struggle to keep up, leading to a sense of unfairness overall. This perceived unfairness is going to drive players to seek ways to level the playing field. In Elden Ring, this often translates to those cheesing strategies, or exploiting game mechanics or using powerful summons to bypass the intended challenge. If the game itself seems unfair, players might reason, why shouldn't they use every tool at their disposal to compensate? I want to bring back that quote from an early interview with Famitsu, where Miyazaki was reflecting on the idea of fair challenge. This was of course in relation to Demon's Souls, but the same could be said of Elden Ring too. It's a difficult game, and you end up getting defeated a lot. So, we try to make sure that the reason you get defeated isn't the game's fault. If you're going to get defeated, we want it to be because of the player. Otherwise, the player won't want to grow or think about it. It's unfair to die because the game or the system. It's also not good to win by chance. We try not to make it something like, you can win if you keep trying. It's a way to make sure that even if you get defeated, you don't get discouraged and you keep trying. Despite this stated intent, as the difficulty in Elden Ring escalates, the opportunity to outwit bosses becomes increasingly limited. The game's design shifts from encouraging clever strategies to overwhelming players with relentless, high-speed attacks. Bosses like Radahn demand a level of reaction time that is challenging even for the most skilled players. This shift creates a gap between the intended challenge and the player's actual experience. When the game relies heavily on escalating demands for reaction time, it sets up an arm race that's difficult to sustain. Players may find themselves stuck in a cycle where the only way to progress is through increasingly refined cheesing strategies. Miyazaki's vision was to offer a fair challenge, where players could grow and learn from their mistakes. However, as Elden Ring's chosen style of difficulty begins to ramp up, it becomes harder to meet this ideal. The more the game pushes reaction times to their limits, the more it diverges from its goal of meaningful skill-based challenge. This escalating difficulty, which increasingly relies on speed and reaction times, leads to a form of stagnation. The challenge becomes less about innovation or skill, and more about surviving an endless cycle of heightened demands. If difficulty is only considered in terms of speed and reaction time, it risks becoming a monotonous arms race with a natural ceiling. In essence, when a game demands ever-increasing levels of precision, it often exceeds the practical limits of most players' reaction times. This fosters a sense of unfairness and leads to that reliance on cheese strategies. While these strategies may help players overcome the challenges, it also shifts the experience away from meaningful skill development and towards an ultimately less satisfying form of gameplay. As Elden Ring progresses, the difficulty often escalates through familiar methods. These faster attacks, more intricate attack patterns, and a relentless barrage of visual effects. While these elements initially heighten the challenge, they also risk leading to a state of stagnation within the game's design. This stagnation, driven by repetitive difficulty mechanisms, ultimately diminishes the game's appeal and its depth. At its core, the challenge in many action RPGs is designed to test a player's mechanical skill and strategic thinking. Ideally, difficulty should evolve by introducing new mechanics, requiring players to adapt and strategize in novel ways. However, when the primary method of increasing difficulty is simply to ramp up the speed and intensity of attacks, the game risks falling into a repetitive cycle. Instead of presenting fresh and engaging challenges, the game resorts to amplifying the same elements. This approach makes the experience feel less dynamic and more monotonous over time. What once felt exhilarating becomes predictable and tiresome, as the core challenge doesn't evolve, merely intensifies. This repetitive approach undermines the sense of accomplishment that comes from overcoming diverse and well-designed challenges. Instead of offering new and engaging forms of difficulty, the game becomes a test of endurance against an ever more frenetic assault of attacks. The sense of progression is stunted, and players are repeatedly faced with the variations of the same thing. To break free from this cycle of stagnation, the game design needs to innovate. Rather than merely increasing speed or visual intensity, the game should be introducing new mechanics, unexpected strategies, or diversifying enemy behaviors that require players to engage in meaningful ways. This innovation should help keep the experience fresh and engaging, ensuring that challenges remain compelling throughout the game through to its end. So, where can we look instead? Well, as ever, we can look to our history for these answers, previous Souls games. Often, bosses themselves were not all that threatening in isolation, but the environments in which they fought increased the challenge to the player naturally. Bosses like the Taurus and Capra demons found early in Dark Souls don't have particularly complex movesets, and don't deal huge amounts of damage, but are still considered a strong early game challenge, and they leave a memorable impression. But why? Well, it has a lot to do with the environment they're fought in. The Taurus demon is on a narrow bridge. Importantly, this doesn't impede the player's ability to see, and the player isn't forced to wrestle with a non-compliant camera perspective. It forces the player to consider positioning, distance from falls, and more, while dealing with a relatively aggressive enemy that favors close quarters. Bonus points here for the addition of the raised platform from behind, reached with a cleverly concealed ladder, providing opportunities for bonus damage for the player that can create separation from the demon. The player is rewarded for understanding the environment of the boss room, observing, and maybe being taught with an arrow to the back, in a way that speaks to Miyazaki's original intent. The main concept behind the death system is trial and error. The difficulty is high, but always achievable. Everyone can achieve without all that much technique. All you need to do is learn, from your deaths, how to overcome the difficulties. Overcoming challenges by learning something in a game is a very rewarding feeling, and that's what I wanted to prioritize with Dark Souls and Demon Souls. Contrast this with many of the boss encounters in Elden Ring, such as those found in the Shadow of the Erdtree. Here, bosses are often placed in expansive, circular arenas that, while visually impressive, frequently offer little more than an escalating series of attack patterns that require near-perfect reactions. As we've covered throughout this section, this approach leads to a sense of monotony, where the challenge feels repetitive rather than refreshingly varied. To wrap this section up, I want to leave this section of that Famitsu article on Demon Souls for reflection. Enemies always have weak points, and if you exploit them, you can defeat them. That's right. It's designed so that you can win if you think about it carefully. Even if there are these 3 great rotters in a swamp where rolling is impossible to avoid, you can win surprisingly easily if you lure them onto land. I want you to look for various strategies like that. I want you to devise, discover, and win one by one. I don't think it would be helpful to force it on you too much, so I don't explain anything in the game, but the concept of this game is for you to solve it on your own. It's a difficult game, but I made it so that even someone like me who isn't good at action games can clear it, so I hope you'll think carefully as you play and get through it. It's more rewarding to be broken down, so I hope you'll give it a try. I think there's something great waiting for you beyond that. If I could give you one hint, it would be that shields are strong. If you feel like you're struggling, I hope you'll go back to basics. Also, we've made it so that even people who aren't good at action games can play, so please don't give up and give it a try. It's not about getting good at the game, but about thinking about how to get better. That's the game we're aiming for, and we want to provide a sense of accomplishment at the end. Based on my experiences with large parts of Elden Ring, I feel that we've lost something of that thought process. Returning to the basics of thoughtful, environment-based challenges could rejuvenate the sense of accomplishment that comes from overcoming well-designed bosses. If future games lean too heavily on escalation through speed and visual overload, I think we're really at risk of losing the nuanced strategic depth that made the Souls series both challenging and rewarding. It's a shift that, if unaddressed, could strip future titles of the unique and meaningful challenges that define their predecessors. As we wrap up this second part of our journey through Elden Ring, we've tackled one of the most polarizing aspects of this game, and the Souls-like genre as a whole: difficulty. We've looked at how Elden Ring's world design, the player toolkit, and boss encounters often walk a fine line between challenging and frustrating, and how, sometimes, that line feels crossed. For many, I'm sure these elements are part of Elden Ring's charm. For me, these elements are roadblocks, detracting from the immersive and artistic experience FromSoftware aims to create. Thank you for sticking with me through these points, especially if you're someone who loves Elden Ring, but maybe finds yourself nodding along, or even if you're shaking your head in disagreement. I think that's the beauty of discussions around art and design. There's rooms for all perspectives. In the third and final part of this series, we'll dive into what could be different, exploring how Elden Ring could evolve by taking cues from other standout games like Death Stranding and Red Dead Redemption 2. We'll imagine a future for FromSoftware, one that holds onto its signature style, but adapts to create an experience that challenges without alienating, immerses without overwhelming. So, if you're curious about where the Souls-like genre might go from here, and what could be refined or reimagined in a potential Elden Ring 2 or future FromSoftware titles, you won't want to miss it. Thank you again for watching, and if you enjoyed this deep dive, don't forget to like, subscribe, and let me know your thoughts in the comments. I'll see you in part 3.